Do you desire to come to the climax of your day with fashionable food and delicious drinks? Ever wonder what transitioning from afternoon to night, where you are personally serenaded by a band of hot young studs, would be like? Are you curious about Italian food, but want to stay away from California's bastardized, somehow both soupy and chewy version of pizza? Well, do I have just the place for you where you can also say I do and stay for your honeymoon too? Let me present to you the Cucumber Lounge, located in Eureka on the shoulder of the 101. We here at the Cucumber Lounge would achieve such pleasure if you would allow our tanned and beautiful waitstaff and expert cooks to erect for you a sumptuous meal replete with non-pickled delectables and nightly music from our house band. Stop by today and use the code MARON for a 50% discount on our new edible glass. Look out for our towering neon road sign, notorious all over the Vineland area. It's a big old revolving cucumber. We look forward to seeing you soon. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts here.
My name is Cody.
My name is Luke.
I'm Will.
Today we are going to be jumping into the next book that we've decided to discuss now that we've completed Mason and Dixon, and that one is going to be Vineland. Unlike last time, we are not going to be following the subreddit guide that they took on their journey through this book exactly. They did it one chapter at a time for the sake of brevity, because these chapters are going to be significantly shorter in general than the ones in Mason and Dixon. We're going to be doing, for the most part, 2 chapters each week, with the exception of chapter 9 and chapter 12, which happen to be longer chapters, so those will get their own episodes. And with that being said, I'd really just like to open up the podcast with kind of our general thoughts about the book itself. This book kind of occupies a strange position in the Pynchon canon, in that it is oftentimes sort of denigrated or put
You're being
into...
nice.
Yeah, I guess I am being nice. Denigrated or just like generally frowned upon as either skippable, or like if you're going to read it, you're probably just going to read it because you want to read everything Pynchon wrote. Pynchon-lite is usually the terminology that I have seen added to this most frequently by people in the modern culture of like reviewing books on Goodreads or modern readers in a lot of instances. For my money, I think that's completely undeserved criticism. I think that any book published by any author after something like Gravity's Rainbow, which this book was, would likely have received a similar reception just because of what Gravity's Rainbow was and the significant time it took to go from Gravity's Rainbow to the publishing of Vineland. Just to give like a little bit of backstory for you all on the book itself, this came off of the heels of a extended hiatus that Thomas Pynchon was on. He most likely was writing Mason and Dixon Against the Day and Vineland at the same time, and so a chunk of the reasoning behind why it took so long was the fact that he was working on 2 significantly heftier novels. But Vineland is a novel published in 1990. It is part of Thomas Pynchon's California trilogy, as it is sort of represented. And as previously mentioned, it comes off of the heels of his most well-known work, Gravity's Rainbow, of course, which was published in 1973. So there's a significant gap between that. And that is my belief as to why it has the reputation it has. My own personal experience with the book, I read it when I was reading through the California trilogy. I started with Inherent Vice, as I've mentioned on my first episode with the show. That was the book that really got me into Pynchon and was where I started. And then I did it out of order. I read Crying of Lot 49 after that, and then really wanted something that hopefully had like a similar stylistic vein to Inherent Vice. So then I read Vineland. And I love it. I think it is genuinely an underrated book in his canon. I think that there's a lot to discuss. I think that what we're all hoping for in doing this show is that we can kind of provide a different perspective on the book and hopefully invite people to reconsider what their previously held beliefs or opinions on the book might have been. So that's my thoughts on the book and just a bit of backstory. What is your guys' history with this book? Your thoughts on it? What do you guys think?
I mean, for me, I'm totally on board with the idea that this is an unfairly underappreciated book of his. And I think you summarized almost exactly why. The gap in time between Gravity's Rainbow and this, the fact that it's not more Gravity's Rainbow, which I think is what a lot of people were wanting. It's also it's stylistically a bit of a shift from what Gravity's Rainbow was and into not something totally different, but it doesn't have the same I don't want to say technicality that Gravity's Rainbow had, but Gravity's Rainbow had a very technical and just a different feel overall. It wasn't as warm. I mean, definitely not as warm as something like Vineland or some of his other, Mason and Dixon. So I think, a lot of that comes from the fact that it just, everybody read Gravity's Rainbow, waited 27 years for it, and then they got something that it just wasn't, I guess, what they were expecting it to be. And so they just unfairly assumed that it's, not worth their consideration or the time to actually like reread it or engage with it on the same level as Gravity's Rainbow. And even for people reading it now who don't have to wait that long, almost 3 decades to get a book after they finish Gravity's Rainbow, I think it comes down to the same thing. I think that they, so many people start with Gravity's Rainbow and then to jump from that to Vineland, while they are very different books, there's still so much so many through lines between the two because it's the same author. There's so much to love about this book. It's one of his funniest. I think we talked about that at the beginning of Mason and Dixon. Like those two, and maybe Inherent Vice might be his funniest books. Like flat out, I will laugh out loud at certain scenes in all of those books. And I think the other major thing that marked a difference with this book was that I may be mistaken on the timelines, but I think this is around the time I know he had just gotten married to his, at the time, editor. I think she stayed as editor too after they were married. I don't think they had Jackson at that time. But obviously, a lot changes in a person over 27 years. So there's a lot of stylistic shift and thematic shift that happens between Gravity's Rainbow and something like this. And so it's not going to be the same book. And it's absolutely unfair for people to consider that it should be the same book and to dismiss it outright because it's not. And I hate the term Pynchon-lite. And I really think this is where that term started.
Oh,
and
yeah, absolutely.
It's a terrible reductive phrase that just does a disservice. You're judging it. I think when people hear that this is Pynchon-lite or Bleeding Edge is Pynchon-lite, that's setting a tone for them that it's automatically kind of putting that seed in the back of their mind, and it's going to cloud their ability to really enjoy it on a first read. So if this is, for those of you listening, if this is your first read, get rid of that idea because this is not Pynchon-lite. It's not easy by any means. You still have to really there's a lot to really still pick apart from within this book, and it's just as Pynchon as Gravity's Rainbow, as Against the Day, as Mason and Dixon. It's just a different story, and it's personally one of my favorites.
What do you think?
I think it's 17 years, by the way. So I think
Is it
27
17?
years is from B. Yeah, because I think it's 70
you're right.
to 90. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
17. Still a long time.
Yeah,
A long time, yeah.
Either way.
What do you think of the book in general, Luke? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I did just finish an audio listening to the audiobook of the book the other day in preparation for doing this podcast because I like to kind of read the book again before we even start and then reread it for a third or fourth time after that for this podcast. But I like this book a lot. I think it's enjoyable. I didn't enjoy the audiobook very much. The dialogue in this book kind of comes across as cringe in that audiobook. To be
Is
perfectly
it just because
honest,
of
and
how it's read?
I think it's
Or
because it's how it's read. Because whenever I was
okay.
reading it again, reading the first two chapters again, it didn't come across nearly as like the way the audiobook I read it was very like stonery and like hippie
Mm,
dropout kind of parody voice and I don't know. I mean, that kind of maybe dovetails with something I was wanting to talk about because this does kind of remind me of um, Colorado and some people I know in Colorado. Some people I've been around in Colorado where it's kind of a more mountainous area. There's a lot of forests. There's a lot of dropouts and kind of more druggy type people. A lot more hippies and stuff, which is can be true of Colorado, where I've spent a lot of time, a lot of my life. But it reminds me of some people I know from there and the way that they talk, and it does kind of hit home. And it also reminded me of a few different Cormac McCarthy novels, especially Child of God. It's kind of like a lot more lighthearted and not nearly as fucked up version of Child of God, where it's this kind of misfit guy who everyone knows going around doing all this weird stuff. But instead of it being like really transgressive and in your face with how fucked up it is, it's a lot more lighthearted. Um, this is a warm book. It is kind of at the beginning of his more human books. I mean, for me, it is kind of lower tier Pynchon in terms of how much I enjoy it. It's kind of down there with like V, in terms of my least favorite Pynchon novels. That being said, I mean it's still Pynchon, and there's still a lot of depth here. Um, even you can. I'm looking forward to kind of parsing the first two chapters because there is, especially the first chapter, it is kind of deceivingly. It's not simple at all. It's still Pynchon. The prose is still beautiful. Um, the plot starts off pretty propulsive. It is kind of like a. It doesn't start directly in media res, but we do get to the action pretty quickly. And the action is pretty zany and interesting. Um, and I do kind of enjoy the whole like post hippie kind of hangover vibe of the book.
Mhm.
There's a lot to like about it, and I do really really enjoy it. But like I said, it's not my favorite by Pynchon. I do think it's one of his worst books, but that's on the scale of Pynchon. It's not. There's no book by him that I regret reading or that I don't enjoy. And I have come across some of the stuff that we're going to talk about, I think, in terms of it being just like unrightfully disparaged. But I do agree that it doesn't deserve nearly as much hate as it tends to get.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And it's funny that you say the dialogue comes across as cringe because that's always why I don't listen to the audiobooks for his books or have been wary about it. Is I feel like hearing hearing those pieces of dialogue read out would be like kind of insane in a lot of instances.
mhm.
In speaking of like Cormac McCarthy, I feel like the movie that he did the screenplay for, The Counselor, where it is basically just Cormac McCarthy dialogue said aloud, also sounds ridiculous coming out of human just mouths that are on screen, and Michael Fassbender and everyone in that movie. I feel like I would have the same experience listening to the audiobooks in most cases. Um, so that brings us to Will, and I wanted to ask for his thoughts last, not only just to sort of wrap up the four of us, but also to introduce sort of the concept of how the book has been kind of unfairly judged, because Will did some extra research into that particular sphere. So, Will, what were your thoughts, and then what was the research that you did?
Yeah, I really like the book. I think it's really fantastic. And that's because I like most of the like conceptual things going on with the book, but also on a much more primary level. I mean, it is less technical. I think that is a good way to put it, Cody. It is less technically written.
Mhm.
not just because, we don't have characters who are plastics engineers or astronomers, but also that it seems like, somewhere along the way in those 17 years, Pynchon kind of developed a certain appreciation for humanity's joie de vivre in and of itself, in a way that he clearly demonstrated, but didn't really seem to think it was, crucial to his project in his earlier works. And I really do think that even though Vineland and, Inherent Vice, and I'm sure Bleeding Edge, though I haven't read it, are less technically written in that prosaic sense, they are not actually like worse written. It's not like we're saying this as some kind of shorthand for, oh, it's worse, but we're going to be pretentious about it. It's not worse. It's the difference is that in those big scary books of Pynchon's with the technical writing, he is bragging. He is writing everything, maybe not with the end goal of showing off, but he doesn't care. He has no shame about showing off. That's not in his mind at all, or it's his primary purpose to some, or not primary, secondary purpose to some degree. In these books, he has clearly taken the note of, hey guy, not everyone knows all the words and all the things that you do. You can still be like cool and jazzy with your language. You can still structure analogies incredibly densely and write in an insane jazz bebop meter consistently.
Mhm.
You can still do all of that without loading everything with hidden jokes, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. I mean, it's a case of doing more with less, and that's there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think to use a sort of like I guess a baseball analogy, like you don't have to swing for the fences every time. It's great to hit a home run, but you can still win a game. Just keeping the ball on the ground, and
exactly
that's what he's doing here.
Yeah, and you can see that. I would say that the book that is most similar in style to this one is actually Against the Day. And Against the Day is that technical because its characters are that technical.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me demonstrates that this is not like some lag in quality or some desire to say, hey, I'm going to dumb it down, but instead to say, hey, other people exist who aren't engineers.
Nonsense.
Right. If anything, it's a good representation of his growth as a writer, that he's able to still do a book like this and get across the themes and the concepts that he's trying to get across without adding a lot of flourish and keeping it tight, really.
And it's really interesting how you mentioned not swinging for the fences every time, because if you were going to ask me directly what I thought the reason that everybody hated Vineland, to use a little bit of hyperbole, I would point everybody to, and this is not to criticize who I'm about to introduce, I would point everybody to David Cowart, the academic who published in 1990 in the journal Critique Studies in Contemporary Fiction, Attenuated Postmodernism, Pynchon's Vineland, from the University of Southern California. And I'm gonna read a little bit from this paper, more than I will just this instant. But I would summarize the reason with this sentence. The bad news. Pynchon has made no effort to surpass gravity's rainbow. Because if you dig through immediately contemporary papers that cite this one, it really seems like that's where they stopped reading. It seems like everybody saw this paper and said, hey, yeah, he didn't try to surpass gravity's rainbow. And I think that's a very funny thing to criticize the book for. And he's, to be fair to Cowart, he is not doing that. David Cowart is being completely fair. He is not trying to surpass Gravity's Rainbow, and that is bad news to a lot of people, especially people whose job it is to study literature.
Mm-hmm.
However, I'm going to now read the rest of that introductory paragraph, and that'll be the end of my reading from sources. But I think it demonstrates very well kind of the disconnect between what the four of us have said about the book and what it seems like the literary establishment and following them, the popular culture, felt about the book. Thomas Pynchon, creator of the most significant body of fiction in contemporary America, may have spent some of the last 17 years discovering the limits of the postmodernist aesthetic. Vineland, his long-awaited fourth novel, appears 17 years after the publication in 1973 of the monumental Gravity's Rainbow, widely recognized now as the most important American novel published since World War II. One naturally asks whether this author's art has developed or stagnated over those 17 years. The bad news: Pynchon has made no effort to surpass Gravity's Rainbow. The good news: he has not stood still as a maker of fiction. In Vineland, which may represent a turning point for Pynchon, the author keeps his hand in, modifying some of his old tricks and trying out new ones. In a consideration of this novel's traditional and contemporary features, one encounters an evolutionary text, an experiment in literary hybridization. Conceding that the postures of literary exhaustion may themselves be exhausted, the author combines modernist concerns and postmodernist techniques with some of the features of two kinds of realism, social and magic. The following essay, while scrutinizing the vestiges of a style of aesthetic that Pynchon seems to be outgrowing, will glance at the Abish-like question, how postmodern is it? In the course of gauging the traditional elements and fresh invention that compose this hybrid. The argument here, introduced in a brief comparison of Pynchon's career with that of Joyce, will focus on technique and the treatment given history and culture, including myth. The author of Vineland views these topics through a postmodern lens. They appear foreshortened, flattened, all-surface. Yet the novel's title and its mythic extension of contemporary history hint at a broader view. Though Pynchon tends to deconstruct the myths he invokes, they complicate the rendering of an otherwise comprehensively ahistorical contemporaneity. Through a combination of this eccentric mythography with a moral earnestness expressed as a penchant for political didacticism, Pynchon produces, in Vineland, a fiction devoted less to indeterminate postmodernist play than to totalizing modernist purpose. Now, I have been the one... end of quote. Now, I have been the one on this show in the past, bringing up this whole modernist, postmodernist dialectic before. So I hope people take it in good faith when I say I don't understand really what Cowart is trying to say there. And I've read the essay, and I do now understand what he's trying to say, literally. But I think it rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of a couple of things. First of all, the idea that Pynchon's previous works did not take care to situate the actual experience of the reader in the time being portrayed. I think it was probably easier back then to ignore that, especially, Cowart was probably somebody who read Gravity's Rainbow when it came out and spent years studying it, and probably had family who had been around, since well before the 40s, and so knew what people sounded like, knew how people talked, and so it's probably to some extent underestimating just how well Pynchon actually encodes those senses into his previous works. But the bigger thing I'm going to point out is that the primary mechanism by which this article, this essay, discusses Pynchon is by analogy to James Joyce. I'm a big fan of Joyce. James Joyce did try to surpass Ulysses, and maybe 100 people have read Finnegan's Wake.
100, you think?
I think maybe, yeah. As one of them who's read part of it, it's, probably 100 maybe. Since 1939. Like, seriously. Pynchon wears his Joyce adoration on his sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over the place in all of his books, and it's very subtle if you are not also a fan of James Joyce, but it's there. Pynchon knows that nobody read Finnegan's Wake. Pynchon knows that it doesn't matter if your book is not winning the National Book Award. It doesn't matter if your book isn't being sold in every store for the next 20 years. That doesn't matter. All that matters is you write a work that matters to someone. You know, that's the idea, right? That's what he says throughout all of his works whenever he talks about artistry. And even that line of thinking has its limits. There's no way in hell anybody was going to read something that was more formally experimental than Gravity's Rainbow. Period. Especially not after the 80s. It just wasn't going to happen. And the fundamental issue here is that people seem to have taken this idea that he's leaning more into, modernist concerns as some kind of de-escalation of those concerns. When they're not. They just are not. Postmodernist concerns are like meta concerns. That is the issue of postmodernism is the issue of issues. It's not something that really has a lot of bulk to it, which he gets at. But modernist issues are just all of the other issues, if you're going to frame them as a dichotomy.
Mm.
There are postmodernist issues, which are issues of nothing, and there are all of the others. And so Pynchon takes this book to write a family drama that is incredibly dense with allusion and poetry and meaningful symbolism that is couched in like painfully cringy political didacticism, and continues to make an impressive novel that does not suit itself with the concerns of a book published in the 1910s or 1920s. However, this is how it was discussed. Everybody treated Thomas Pynchon as, quote, creator of the most significant body of fiction in contemporary America. You can't live up to that. It's not a matter of even people having their expectations up. People were talking about him like that. They weren't expecting a book. They were expecting a Bible. And they already got a Bible, so I don't know why they were expecting another one.
Yeah.
Even Jesus needed to perform a sequel by raising from the dead. I think
Bible too. Don't cross him.
Well, there's two things you brought up that immediately put thoughts in my head. Will, one, the thing you said, trying to compose a piece of work with the stated goal of always having copies in stores and always selling copies and all of that. I do find it very ironic that this is the book that I have seen in stores exactly one time. I've seen one copy of Vineland, and it is the first edition hardcover copy that I own. Outside of that, I have never seen Vineland in stores. So he just certainly for whatever reason.
New copy or used even?
I've never found any copies other than the one that I own. I know fully well that I can order them.
I found new copies.
Yeah, I know that there's the Penguin Modern Classics copy that generally floats around in stores, but
yeah, I see that one at half price a lot.
For some reason, I've just never come across one. I don't know why. Maybe they're not in existence in Wisconsin for some reason.
People are buying them. That's good.
Yeah, maybe. So he certainly didn't succeed at that, at least not in the Midwestern territories anyway. But I think the other thing that you quoted by Cowart that really stuck out to me was the quotation of how postmodern is it, which I'm going to say something kind of controversial. I think a lot of the people on subreddits like Thomas Pynchon or the associated members of the literary sort of field that you wrote in can be guilty of thinking that way when it comes to Vineland, or really the approach of reading anything. From the standpoint of, well, if I'm going to read this, how postmodern is it? That's what I'm really into. And if it ends up being somewhat outside of that lens, maybe I don't want to read it. When every author has change and evolution and becomes different over time. Sometimes they get worse, like James Patterson, or sometimes,
Well,
or
is
sometimes
James Patterson
they
really
just.
writing books anymore? Let's be fair there.
And I would also say that's worse than actually writing them.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton's writing all of his stuff now.
Yeah, or sometimes you have a writer who can just hammer out like 1,000 books a year, like a Colleen Hoover, where pretty much just it always stays the same. But in general, most writers do have some kind of an evolution where they change the things that they're interested in, and they develop a new style or a new attitude towards things. And like we've already said, 17 years passed in which Thomas Pynchon was like harangued by the press, and he won the National Book Award and basically won the Pulitzer, and people started treating his last book like a Bible, as you said, and as the creator of the greatest body of work in contemporary literature. And then he got married and may or may not have had a child at this point. Like, people not expecting him to be different after all of that.
Yeah. It's unfair.
It's unfair, but it's also frankly insane.
Yeah.
Like, if you think back to where you were 17 years ago, no matter how old
Yeah.
you are right now, are you anything like what you used to be? Maybe if you are, 80 years old, the show, maybe you'll be about the same. But for most people who are through their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, like there is still a significant amount of evolution that takes place over a time scale like
for sure.
that.
How dare you? I was reading Ulysses at age 10.
That's very impressive. Will.
Yeah, but
It was upside down, but I read it.
And yeah, I think that, speaking of Ulysses, I think that your dichotomy of Ulysses to Finnegan's Wake to Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow to Vineland is very apt. I mean, I personally subscribe to the idea that Finnegan's Wake was mostly written as an exercise to fuck with the reviewing public and the people who were trying to sort of ascertain all of the individual little meanings out of everything that James Joyce was writing. I'm sure that he had a genuine plan there and a genuine theme and all of that. I don't think that the book was composed entirely as a joke, but I think that historically, looking at the ways in which he responded to people who had questions about it and were trying to understand the point of it, where he would just laugh at them while he was literally on his deathbed, is very telling of the sort of way that he had approached that work, especially after it being published. Versus, you go from a Gravity's Rainbow to a Vineland and you see, in my opinion, a more mature writer. I genuinely believe that Gravity's
more
Rainbow,
nuanced, more
Gravity's Rainbow is a masterpiece. Absolutely, it is, and is a work of fiction written by someone who it cannot be replicated no matter how hard you tried, and it has so much to say about basically everything of import at that time, and that is eternally relevant. All of the things that have been said about it, all of the ink that's been spilled about it is so true. But I think that the ability to then move into a book like Vineland, which to Cody's point is more nuanced, is significantly warmer as far as its relationship, even in the first 2 chapters of establishing the relationship between Zoyd and his daughter, and everything that he does over the course of the book is, I believe, all earmarked by a writer who is becoming more mature in his characterization, more mature in trying to understand how people work and present that on the page accurately. Because outside of a handful of characters in Gravity's Rainbow and, Crying of Lot 49, none of Pynchon's characters seem like real people, or people that you could encounter or have experiences that we can relate to.
Up to this novel, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But suddenly that starts to emerge in Vineland. Is it different? Yeah. Yes. Is it bad? Certainly not.
Yeah, and it's notable that you mentioned, there's no one could ever write something like Gravity's Rainbow again. And that's 100% true on all of the latitudes, from the obvious to the complex. But especially relevant to this is that he was like 32 years old. Yes, is he a grown man? Sure. 32-year-olds are not experts in anything, and he wrote a book about everything.
Yeah.
So the fact that like there are major gaps in that book. Absolutely. And a lot of those gaps are in some way symbolically filled by Vineland.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself.
Yeah. I think the last thing I want to say about it is, to kind of touch on what everybody's kind of, I mean, everyone has made great points about, what the difference between Gravity's Rainbow and Vineland. I think at the end of the day, no matter what he put out after Gravity's Rainbow was going to get shit on, regardless of what it was. If it was Gravity's Rainbow 2.0, people would have shit on it all over it because it's Gravity's Rainbow. He's just trying to do the same thing again. He was put in a situation where a lot of other writers would have felt that they were, trapped in a corner, and probably honestly would have tried to do a Gravity's Rainbow 2.0. He did what I think is the smarter move, the better move for him as a person and as a writer, which is to just write what he wanted to write. And what we got was Vineland and Mason and Dixon Against the Day. And I think we're all the better for that because we got the trajectory that he got as a growing and maturing writer, rather than someone writing an incredibly successful novel that pushed a lot of boundaries of literature, that was critically lauded, rightly so, but he didn't try to follow that up with more of the same. And I think he deserves commendation for that.
And I would invite the reader / listener of this show and the books that accompany it, having just finished Mason and Dixon, if you've been reading along with us, to consider what would have happened if he published that after Gravity's Rainbow. He probably would have been criticized for not being able to discuss just as impactful topics in an economy of words when compared to Gravity's Rainbow from a standpoint of length. And he also likely would have been criticized for not being able to do it in plainer language when compared to Gravity's Rainbow. Most likely the criticism, if I was to guess, would be Thomas Pynchon is trying to find a way to be just as smart as he always has been, but in different ways than Gravity's Rainbow, and it fails because he's gone too far. By trying to render his book in 16th century dialogue and by expanding the length out to 800 pages that tells the life of two relatively unknown historical figures, we see the limits of his ability as a writer who's constantly trying to one-up him. Probably would have been something along the lines of the criticism would have come out after this.
And there are I have two notes that I would add to that I think are more damning, that would have been read as more damning than anything you said. If Mason and Dixon had been published in like 1989. Mason and Dixon is by far Pynchon's most Finnegan's Wakey book. People would have shat on him so hard. Like, critics would have hated it, even if they wanted to like the book. On the face of it, as pretentious as that paragraph of David Cowart's essay is, they would have hated it if they actually got something as ambitious as what they're talking about, like you said, because it would be exactly what they were expecting.
Yep.
And gosh, where did it go, brain? Never mind. Anyway, yeah.
Cody, did you want to read the quote you found by Harold Bloom?
Yeah. So while Will was reading his quote from David Coward, I was curious. My brain just immediately went to Harold Bloom because he's always kind of the go-to for Pynchon praise. In 1990, I'm quoting this from there's a review called Pynchon's Pop Fiction. By Eric Sandberg. This was published in 2013 from the New Rambler, which is an online magazine. Oh, I'm sorry. This is November 2015. And I'll post the link if anybody's curious on this. We'll put this in the show notes. But in there, he says, not every reader has been comfortable with this shift in Pynchon's work. Harold Bloom, in a 1991 interview with Antonio Weiss, described Vineland as a, quote, total disaster, end quote. In fact, the greatest, quote, disaster in modern American fiction, a piece of sheer ineptitude, a hopelessly hollow book that has got that has not got in it a redeeming sentence, hardly a redeeming phrase, end quote, and contrasted it specifically with the power of his previous work. So
insane.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that gets kind of lost in Pynchon fandom and different stuff is just how popular Gravity's Rainbow was. Like, Gravity's Rainbow would have sold hundreds of thousands of, like, literally, I think over 200,000 copies. So it was always going to be his next book was always going to be a really big deal, and the fact that it took 17 years for it to come out, I think led to a feeling of anticlimax for a lot of people. There's that David Foster Wallace quote it's a pretty famous one. You see it online a lot from a letter from him to Jonathan Franzen, where he talks about how he had read Vineland and he assumed that Pynchon had just spent the past 17 years smoking weed and watching TV. Which is I mean, it's kind of a bitter quote, but it's a pretty good quote. But, I think that just kind of sum up what y'all have been saying is that,
Yeah.
he was always going to get shit for his next book. Like, even if it was somehow better than Gravity's Rainbow, like the initial response would not have been the same. Like I said, I mean, Gravity's Rainbow would have achieved this kind of mythical status, especially given the author's reclusiveness and the fact that he hadn't published again in 17 years. And there were all those, I think we went over all the Wanda Tanaski stuff during Crying of Block 49, but that would have
Yeah.
happened in the 80s, I think. So there was a kind of a question of what Pynchon had been doing with this time that, we'll never really know. I mean, now we can assume that he was writing Mason and Dixon and Against the Day and Vineland, but yeah, I do think that that's kind of a helpful way to look at this book, is that it was never going to be it was impossible for it to match its predecessor.
It finally came back to me, the second thing I was going to say. Sorry. The other issue, if Mason and Dixon had been the next book published, is that the constant refrain for in terms of like actual negative criticism for his first three books, the only consistent issue was the way that he represented women. And there are ways to talk about that forgive him in various ways, and there are ways to talk about it that condemn him in various ways. If he had published Mason and Dixon in 1989, 17 years after Gravity's Rainbow, 17 years in which essentially feminism had begun to take hold in the literary establishment as we speak of it today, as that tide had started to turn away from the old men classics toward, okay, we need to create a new canon with more women, more minority groups. You come out of that 17-year hiatus with another book about two guys with like zero primary female characters. You are not going to get any decent assumption of good faith, even if the next book he'd come out with was Vineland.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other book that I can think of that maybe faced a similar uphill battle from an expectation perspective was maybe The Tunnel by William H. Gass, because he'd been writing that for 26 years and had been releasing portions of it in magazines up until it actually was completed. But yeah, I think all of the points here have been made incredibly well, and I think that if anything, what the four of us are hoping to do with this show is encourage everybody to go into it with a completely open mind. Obviously, a big majority of the people who listen to our show are from the Thomas Pynchon subreddit, because that was where the show started and where everything got put together. And we talk to you guys on that forum somewhat often. So a lot of those people have read this book before, and it is oftentimes the last one that you go to, because it's the sort of completionist thing that people engage in. But if you're going into this book for the first time or the second time, just all we would ask, I think, and we would all agree with this, is just keep an open mind. Mm-hmm. Allow yourself to consider the fact that this is a distinct work, separate from the rest of his canon, just like everything else. This is not a sequel to anything. This is not meant to be an expansion on anything. It deals in, of course, similar themes to other books that he has written, but it is its own distinct work with its own merits that need to be considered without comparison to anything else. And that's really what it is that we're going to do as we break down this book and move forward. Before we get into the chapters as a whole, does anyone have anything else to add to this before we move on?
I just want to assure our audience that don't worry, I will be here to shoehorn in references to the other books. That won't disappear. I will keep doing that good work. But no, it won't be our primary focus at all, because it shouldn't be, and it won't be.
Yeah.
I have nothing else. I mean, I think we covered everything pretty well. This is, to me, I'll make a music analogy here. This is the MBV to Loveless.
Oh, that's not a bad point of comparison.
I think it's almost the same amount of time.
Yeah.
91 to 2013.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. I think with that being said, we should transition into the book as a whole. Will, did you do your lovely summary work?
Well, I did some summary work. I don't know about lovely, but... So, chapter 1. Our first introduction to whom seems to be the protagonist of the books shows Zoyd Wheeler waking up late one morning in 1984 to find that his daughter Prairie had finished off the Count Chocula before heading to work, and that he was out of cigarettes. So, after a bowl of Fruit Loops topped with Nesquik, and smoking a few still useful butts, he calls in to formally deliver his peremptory press release to the local news. It comes to seem that Zoyd has plans to renew his mental disability checks policy by, as usual, dressing up in a brilliant muumuu and, unusually for him, chainsawing a lager bar to bits in full view of the press. According to the person on the other end of the phone, that was not the plan they knew. Shrugging this off, Zoyd drives off to his preferred discount plus-size store to collect his outfit and fill up his car and purse-sized chainsaw. On the way to Logjam, Zoyd defends his fashion choices to onlookers before arriving to find, horribly, that all the wood accoutrement in the establishment had been replaced with more upscale materials sometime in the last month. Furthermore, the bartender, an old bandmate of Zoyd's, explains to him that no channel's gonna send no crew this far out of town, and advises him to stick to what his brand's good for, jumping through plate glass windows. According to Zoyd, that gig was just a little too pricey these days. Lawyers were always after him for damages that used to mostly be forgiven. He and the bartender continued to chat, and talk about the new Star Wars and the changing times as various lumberjacks become hypnotized by Zoyd's own visage of the divine feminine and make clumsy passes. Before Zoyd can move on out of his own accord, Van Meter, his producer of sorts, calls the bar's phone, demanding Zoyd explain his absence from the set of the news story. The camera crews down at the Cucumber Lounge were getting impatient. Van also did not know the reason for the change-up. He'd just gotten the call. Hanging up, Zoyd departs the logjam as graciously as his idolaters will allow, and reverses his journey. When he finally asks Meter the meaning of all this, he is only pointed toward the figure of Hector Zuniga, the DEA agent, who'd been trailing him for years and trying to bring him into the fold of informants listed in the agency's Rolodexes. They exchange a few brief words before Zoyd assumes his role for the cameras. When the glass shatters in some new way, Hector punctuates the meeting with a bite out of a shard, and Zoyd knows more or less he has to attend the meeting tomorrow that Hector had insisted on. Arriving home after the traditional lockup and subsequent release, Prairie's first question for Zoyd is whether she can cannibalize the dress. Of course she can. After watching the broadcast of the window pane sham, Prairie praises his talent and dedication and shares how much her cadre of pals share that opinion. Especially her boyfriend, Isaiah 2-4, apparently, which surprises her father. He thinks it's best to keep the sugar to himself. They talk some about domestic concerns, money and its lack, the causes for that, and then Isaiah 2-4 comes up again. After fulfilling his patriarchal duty of sternly commanding his daughter not to trust that mohawk-ridden lad, robot name and all, Prairie segues the reproach into a pitch for Zoyd to hear out Isaiah's own pitch. Appearing from nowhere in particular, he appears, and after a clumsy dance of daps set to Purple Haze and Apology, for some previous instance of insult. He launches into a business plan for a shooting range, upgraded with all sorts of colorfully and provocatively distasteful scenarios, from a jungle obstacle course called Third World Thrills with gorilla-shaped targets, to an urban setting with racially diverse criminal elements to fire upon. All he wants from Zoyd is a cosign on the loan. Owing to his tragically poor credit rating, he dodges this tempting offer, but softens the blow with an offer of a gig at a crime family wedding for Isaiah's band. No offense taken, the punk disappears into the bathroom to call about it immediately. They land the job, though it may help for them to practice some classic Italian wedding songs and find some way to pass as a member of the peninsula's descendants. Zoyd's extensive experience in that domain assured him that the boy would be fine, or at least that he'd have plausible deniability should anything go wrong.
Thank you for the summary, Will. I think that it's still lovely. I'm not sure what the self-deprecation was for. You do a great job. As far as general thoughts on these first two chapters, what do we think? How do we feel about these chapters?
I think it's a good start. As Luke mentioned earlier, it gets us into the action pretty quick, and we get a good feel right off the bat, I think, for Zoyd, and even for the other kind of smaller characters that we come across between Hector Zuniga and Prairie. So I think it's it does a good job in, I think it's like 20 pages altogether of really setting the tone and the scene of what the 80s were. Because the 80s were a very unique time in American history.
It's weird.
It was a weird time. So much cocaine. It was, as someone who was born in the 80s, like I was at the tail end of it when I was old enough to start.
That shit.
Do what?
They bottle fed you with that shit.
Yeah, I know. It was like a lot of that carried over into the early 90s, and so as a kid, I was still a lot of the kind of vibe that was left over, the 80s hangover, the haze that was there, the sleaze of it was still in the air in the early 90s. But I think, in these first 20 pages, like it does a great job of really capturing that feel and that time very well, and it will continue to do so as the story goes on. And I think that as we mentioned, in the pre-discussion, there's a lot to unpack in these pages. A lot of pop culture, a lot of interesting ideas that are starting to really be formed, and we're kind of slowly working into what we're going to be really looking at and examining in the book. It's coming off of Mason and Dixon and the opening paragraph for that and the eloquence with which it was written. As we talked about earlier, this isn't the same style of prose necessarily, but I still think it's a really well done opening paragraph. It's does what it needs to do. We understand where we are and who we're seeing, and sets up the story that's to come. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I think to keep in mind, one of the things that kind of exemplifies every single book that Pynchon has written is he's very interested in periods of change, like periods of drastic historical change occurring. So Mason and Dixon, change and evolution and modernity is all over that book the entire time. The change to rockets as a viable weapon usage, and all of the things that will follow that weapon's creation and what it signals to the military industrial complex is a huge period of metamorphosis and change that is covered in Gravity's Rainbow. These are things that he goes through time and time again, and there is a lot to consider in Vineland in particular about how the arrival of the 80s was really a sea change to a lot of things. Yeah. There was the beginning of the mass consumeristic culture that started in the 1980s, especially from a standpoint of pointlessly gendered products, which we already get in the first chapter, and how you need to have these two different categories of people buying two different categories of products, which leads to twice the profit for the company. You have the expansion and really kind of ramping up of like hyper processed foods, and that being a very common thing that people eat. We get that over a lot of the two chapters here. We have kind of the firm death of the hippie movement as an idea and as a thing, which kind of started in '77, sort of around the time that like punk music started to get recorded, which was in a lot of ways a reaction to the hippie movement and rock and roll and all of that. And then you also have the arrival of a subgenre like metal out of that more extreme music happening in the 80s. So it was a massive period of change in American history, and that is very well represented by just the first two chapters here. And I think that was the biggest thing that I felt reading through chapters 1 and 2, is just how well set and well steeped that idea of a metamorphosis in culture and in the country and in people, and the clashing of those ideas was very well presented. But also a lot of this did remind me of my childhood. Like a lot of this did remind me of like eating a giant bag of Cheetos, which they do in front of the TV, and just like watching shitty television, and like the kind of arrival of very distinct subcultures of people in like, you know, Prairie's boyfriend being like either a punk or a metalhead or, you know, whatever particular area that he occupies, and how that is clear from the way that he dresses from head to toe, and like how he dyes his hair a certain color, and like the scheme that he has. The discussion of like video arcades being a part of his like violence amusement center, in addition to real guns and all of that. Like a lot of it did remind me of different elements of my childhood for sure. And just, you know, that's the overall like feeling I get from these chapters, is it's a lot of place setting for the 80s as a decade in the country and what that felt like and how that is changing. And Zoyd Wheeler is a pretty perfect character to use to represent that, because he is somewhat of a revenant of a bygone era by the time this book is starting.
Yeah. I want to piggyback real quick off of what you mentioned about a lot of his books taking place at times of change, because I think that's also something that that we will examine more in this, is not just that this is a period of change, but this is also, I think, a period in American history, really maybe even in world history, but I think uniquely in American history, where the speed at which these cultural schisms start happening, the changes that start popping into like pop culture with, you know, music and TV and everything else, is also due to the extreme uptick in technology and the speed at which that works, and the rapidity with kind could be not just distributed, but processed and distributed across the entire country. So now you have, you know, where these kind of cultural changes were taking a bit of time to actually like get hold into the zeitgeist. This is the time at which those changes start happening a lot faster. Like the punk scene really only lasted less than 10 years.
Yeah.
And then it shifted into hair metal and power metal and you know, speed metal and all that. And then that shifted into the early 90s into both the pop music movement and the alternative rock music. All of that within about 10-15 years, whereas previously those kind of changes happened over decades. So it's a lot of information overload that's happening to society, that I think kind of drives a lot of these changes that are happening around this time.
Yeah, which pairs well with the fact that the Reagan era was really when political accelerationism became a thing.
Hyper-capitalism and political ideology kind of became one thing, and what a beast it became.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, I'm sorry.
Luke, what did you think of these first two chapters?
There's a lot to like here. You know, the opening page where Zoid's kind of scrambling to get up and around. There's country music playing, and kind of the weird mixture of rural, redneck vibes and kind of a more hippie or Western, um, aesthetic is familiar to me in terms of, I lived in the Austin, Texas area. Even parts of the Colorado Front Range, like Denver, can have some aspects of that where it's a weird mixture of rural and urban and liberal and conservative and there's all these. I mean, it's a nice snapshot of America in general, where it's all these kind of different types of people mixing. There's the Star Wars reference, which is really nice. Not yeah, I mean, I really like that. I mean, like the whole thing about it changing the area around there. Like I was just watching the one of the Planet of the Apes movies, one of the modern ones, and that has all the stuff about the redwoods. 'Cause it's a very beautiful area, and that is kind of continuously evoked throughout the book is how beautiful the area that the book takes place in is. Um, Zoyd, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a spoiler, but Zoyd doesn't end up being quite as major of a character as the beginning implies. That being said, he is a really nice kind of intro to the world of the book, where it's kind of all these zany weirdos
Mhm.
on both sides of the law doing all this zany weird stuff. Yeah, I mean, I like the opening a lot. I mean, we'll get into kind of some more of the details later, but there's some kind of the whole thing of mental health, and there needing to be a spectacle to prove that you're mentally ill is really interesting to me. Um, his relationship with his daughter is really well done. Zoe's relationship with Prairie is really well done, I
Mhm.
think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Prairie is a pretty major character in this book, and she does exhibit some real kind of humanity, and she does kind of seem like she could be a real character. She's one of the few characters in this book that um doesn't seem like a caricature of somebody Pynchon knows or something. Like she's not overly stylized like a lot of characters in this book. Um yeah, and I mean we kind of get a setup for the later wedding scene, which is nice. There's some nice foreshadowing of what's to come in these pages. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like here. Like I said, it definitely sets up the rest of the book quite well, in my opinion, in terms of introducing you to the world and to some of the characters.
Yeah, what about you, Will?
Well, I'm going to introduce a reaction which I've brought up a few times in the previous books we've covered on this show,
Mm.
and that is intense nausea. I love these chapters on a word and sentence level. I think the characters are all incredibly well fleshed out. I could not believe myself when I was writing the summary and I came through the introduction to Hector and I was like, oh, he says like 2 lines here. He is such a big character, and I don't mean in the story. I mean he feels huge.
Mm-hmm.
He feels
Mhm.
so much larger than life, and it's not just like, oh, I thought he showed up more. No, he just feels bigger than like 2 paragraphs, and it's part of that has to do with how he intersects with some of the themes of the book and all that. But no, I mean the characterization in these early chapters are incredibly concise and efficient, and the actual subjects are either funny or very entertaining in some other way. But for you old farts,
Thanks.
yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks.
You guys remember the 80s. I don't really remember anything prior to like 99 or so. That the similarity, the the way that in all of his other books you read these first chapters and it's like you're flashed to the past, and it might not be like evocative of humanity, but it is evocative of things in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It is just the same to today as it was in the 1984, and it makes me so sick. Not with the
Yeah.
book, but with ourselves and all of us in America and all of that good stuff.
Well, and that brings up a great point, that what Zoid is doing in order to keep receiving mental disability checks is something that essentially people do for free on the internet and social media all of the time now.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's TikTok. It's
Yeah.
1984 TikTok.
Where maybe people aren't, defenestrating themselves, which I love that there is a word in the English language
Thank you.
specifically.
I thought
Which-
the same thing.
I don't. Yeah. So I had heard the word defenestrate before, but I didn't know what it specifically meant. And upon Googling it to find out that it is a word specifically about either, throwing somebody through a plate glass window or being thrown through a plate glass window of your own volition is crazy to me that has its own definition.
Yeah.
So so maybe people on TikTok aren't defenestrating themselves, but they are doing similarly ridiculous things in public just for the exposure or to be like,
Some of them
potentially
literally
famous.
for a paycheck. Yeah, some of them
Yeah.
literally
Yeah,
for a
yeah.
paycheck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If
That's
you
true.
get famous enough, then yeah, absolutely for a
It's-
paycheck.
Andy Warhol's "Everyone's Famous for 15 Minutes" thing is more
Yeah.
prescient now. I mean, it literally it feels like it's 15 minutes. Like a lot of this stuff, it's they get that fleeting moment of fame online, and then it's on to the next thing. And so, there it was. I hope you had fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know, I know that both you, Luke, and Cody have crazy theories. I promise
I've never
mine are
had a crazy
crazier.
theory.
So right now I'm struggling to say anything that doesn't lead into those. But suffice it to say, I like the book. I really like these chapters on paper. I hate the fact that they feel so immediate to me in 2023. And
Well,
it can't
it's-
have helped that I grew up a decent portion of my childhood in Western Oregon. So I've been around these people.
Yeah.
That's where they went. After Vineland got gentrified, they went to Western Oregon. I know these
It just
people.
went north, yeah. I mean, Zoyd, you can copy. I shouldn't say copy paste. You could look at Zoyd, and if you plugged him into, I would even say like 2002, 2003. That's Jackass. That's those guys.
Yeah, fair.
Doing what they were doing for money, and I think that you could argue the difference between that and what happens on like TikTok and stuff like that now. Like they were doing that to themselves, and Zoyd is doing it to himself. It's not hurting anybody else. The current trends can dip into that, causing harm to others kind of area, unfortunately, but it's still the concept is the same. Yeah, they're doing what Zoyd was doing as quote unquote work for nothing but whatever currency likes are, I guess.
Yeah, I do also find the irony of what Zoyd is doing very funny, in that he is, sort of trying to keep the torch burning for the hippie movement in 1984 by like not working and sort of kind of like sticking it to the man, but is also living off of the government dime by doing something that requires public exposure for receiving his mental disability checks. Like it's such an intersection of like, I guess he's kind of still ripping off the government because he's not actually mentally disabled, but he's pretending to be, but at the same time he's still like receiving benefits from the government and living money. Like it's just it's just a very interesting like intersection of irony, and how a lot of that does still sort of, I think, play into the general insanity of what the 80s are as a decade, and how strange it was, where it just kind of felt like things from the decades prior were dying and something new was taking place that was weird and involved money in ways that wasn't new or was new rather, and hadn't been done before, and just all of the kind of weird metamorphosis that the decade represents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's the trajectory that a lot of those 60s countercultural movement leaders essentially spiraled into, unfortunately. Your Abby Hoffmans and Jerry Rubins and God, I'm blanking on the like Bobby Seale. I don't know about Bobby Seale so much, but that was the thing. Like a lot of them either became a part of the system, or they had to find ways to work with the system to stay alive, basically.
Yeah.
And it sucked, like seeing those people who had such a passion for making a change that they just got beat down so bad, and that's where they landed. But that's what happened, and that's kind of, I think, a big part of this book.
See, I thought you were going to talk about the prescience of Zoyd dressing up as a woman and diving through a glass wall.
It is prescient. I mean,
yeah, fair. So kind of getting to the 80s as a whole and how that represents the book. We have two things mentioned in the first chapter that both myself and Cody have made allusions to in our thoughts about the chapters as a whole, and that is like mass market produced, highly refined food right away, which we get to them eating sugar cereal for breakfast on page 3, like immediately.
Third paragraph.
Yeah, which is like, I mean, that's still a thing, and is still trying to be marketed as like a balanced breakfast, is eating something like Fruit Loops or God forbid Count Chocula.
The glory
which
days
they were out of.
Horribly sugared. I used to eat cookies for breakfast. Cookie Crisp was literally chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah,
that you just poured milk on.
Fucking milk over, and then eat a bowl of it, and then go to school.
Yeah, and they wondered why we couldn't pay attention in class.
Right? Yeah, maybe that was where ADHD began. Cookie Crisp.
Hey now, they changed Cookie Crisp before I was born. And I got the trash Cookie Crisp with no cookies, and I still got ADHD. So it's not that.
I don't think you got the burglar guy either. They took him out of the picture too.
Yeah.
The burglar guy? The cookie.
See?
They changed him, but there was a weird period where they were still airing those ads contemporaneously with the new ones. It's weird.
God, I love the 80s.
The 80s are just so insane. Like, I don't like Wonder Woman 84, bad movie, but it does capture the insanity of like 80s mass market consumerism and like the expansion of malls and everything very well in some of what it does. This is really the only like contemporary sort of thing that I can compare this to. The second thing that we get right away too is as I had previously mentioned, like the creation of just strangely gendered products. Like, why does this need to be specifically for men or specifically for women?
A trend that continues still, sadly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, don't get me started. I will start complaining about women's razors for the next 20 minutes.
Do we want to talk about the ladies' Bic, the pen
and
for women?
I'm not going to the bathroom if I don't have a pack of dude wipes with me.
Oh, yeah. Because only men can use wet wipes when they
Stay away
go
from
to the bathroom.
We only have this one thing.
Yes. Yeah. That's all you get.
So to do a bit of like a close read of the first few words, it is interesting to me that the book starts off with later than usual. Just in the context of, like his first 3 books were all released within like V came out in 63, Law 49 in like 67, and then Gravity's Rainbow in 73. So there's about 5 years between each of them. And then, like we were talking about, there's 17 years between this one and Gravity's Rainbow. So I do think that starting off with later than usual is a really interesting way to start the book.
Well, and continuing on deep read, it's 1984, and it's a creeping fig in the window. I'm not going to connect that second one to anything because that will suck. If I do that now, I'll do it later in the series. I promise.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Otherwise, I'm going to talk about 1984 later in this episode. I think that it's very relevant.
The Van Halen album?
Very obvious.
So the other thing that I wanted to point out from the sentence too, before we go back to the gendered products bit, is it specifically says a summer afternoon in 1984. If they've been eating Count Chocula since the previous October, how bad has that cereal gone by the point that they're upset that they're running out of it in the summertime? Like, that just, I think, goes to show probably the poverty that Zoyd and his daughter are living in more than anything else. But just
that cereal had so much sugar in it, it couldn't age.
It had to be stale. Like,
it came that way. That's how it was processed cardboard that they put sugar on top of and sprinkled a healthy dollop of like chocolate powder on it. There's no nutritional value in that whatsoever.
That's fair. Just that concept, though, that you may have been eating the same the same cereal for almost a year, depending on what month in the summer it is. But we get around to a description of a lady's chainsaw. Does somebody want to read that quote for us?
Yeah, I can take it.
Please do.
Let me pull it up here real quick. I have my book. I didn't highlight in this one or mark anything with pen like I did with Mason and Dixon. So, here we go. Okay. I'll just read the whole paragraph because it's pretty short. The already confused Zoyd, whose survival instincts may not have been working all the way up to spec, decided to produce the chainsaw from his bag. Buster, he called plaintively to the owner behind the bar, where's the media? The implement attracted immediate attention from everyone in the room, not all of it technical curiosity. It was a tailor-made ladies' chainsaw, quote, tough enough for timber, as the commercial said, but petite enough for a purse. The guide bar, handle grips, and housing were faced in genuine mother of pearl and spelled out in rhinestones on the bar. Surrounded by saw teeth ready to buzz was the name of the young woman he'd borrowed it from, which onlookers took to be Zoyd's drag name, Cheryl.
I love that description for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it is such an accurate description of like how women's products would be marketed during this time frame and up to the mid or like the early 2000s, I would say, where there's some sort of, statement like tough enough for timber but small enough for a purse. Like that is such a perfect dichotomy that all of those ads drop. But the other reason I wanted to bring this up specifically, right after I read that, I then immediately thought to myself, oh, I think I'd rather see this book adapted into film by David Lynch than Paul Thomas Anderson. Because something about that image in particular, a man in drag using a borrowed woman's chainsaw that is enough to cut down trees in a city where there is clear cutting happening, but also small enough to put it into a purse and is styled with mother of pearl and rhinestones is just it's a very Lynchian image to me.
It is.
That just matches his overall like weirdness and aesthetic. And that then made me realize that this book is potentially the most Lynchian of any of his books as far as a point of comparison is concerned. And I know, Cody, you had thoughts on this, so please.
I 100% agree. I think if for anyone not familiar with David Lynch's work, number one, turn this off and go watch like Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive or something. Actually, no, finish this episode, then go watch Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive. I think so often people have the same reaction that they do with Pynchon, and that's why I think part of what I love about the two of them is that they share a lot of similarities in the way they construct storytelling. That was a terrible in the way in which they tell stories. I think they both work on a level of abstraction that requires a level of attention from the consumer that is not really prevalent in a lot of mainstream media. So it does take a certain amount of effort, I think, to really appreciate and get into what they do, but it's worth it. I think they both have such a quirky sense of humor and an understanding of American culture, uniquely American culture. I think Lynch often gets dismissed as being really dark and impenetrable, and I think that's due to people maybe stepping into his work with like Eraserhead or Lost Highway, which are much darker works. But stuff like Twin Peaks and Mulholland Drive and even Blue Velvet, which is a dark ass film, have some absolutely hilarious scenes in them. And I think especially having watched Twin Peaks as much as I have, it's one of my favorite shows. I definitely, Lynch could absolutely adapt something like this because he has that really nuanced understanding of American culture, of consumerism within American culture, of the grotesque sort of monstrosity that hides behind this facade of, you know, this American ideal that we've constructed over the years, but we can't really fully hide from anyone really except ourselves, I think, as a culture. So yeah, Lynch would absolutely crush something like this if he chose to do it. And again, if you are not familiar with his work, if you like Vineland, if you like the humor that Pynchon has, go watch Twin Peaks. It is so weird and funny and subversive and beautifully filmed and written all at the same time. He really is truly, I think, the most Pynchon-esque film and TV director and writer that I can think of.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also say that tonally there are some similarities between Blue Velvet and Vineland. Certainly there's less humor in Blue Velvet, but I feel like,
though.
Yeah,
Frank Booth it can be funny as hell, but he's fucking frightening.
And there is David Foster Wallace wrote an essay on David Lynch that's very good. And when he was being interviewed by Charlie Rose about that essay in as a portion of the interview, he asked him what Lynchian meant, because he asked the same question to David Lynch when he was interviewing David Lynch, and David Lynch predictably just sort of blinked at him, because how are you going to respond to that question? And I think David Foster Wallace summed it up perfectly in that he said, David Lynch is the perfect intersection between, like you said, Cody, violence and carnage and American consumerism. And his description of like what Lynchian might be is like a man has murdered his wife because she has consistently purchased the wrong brand of peanut butter. And she's been buying Skippy peanut butter instead of Jif. And there is a scene where the wife is like laying on their kitchen floor dead, but she's wearing like a house dress, and her 50s like beehive bouffant is like undisturbed. And there is a conversation between the husband, who's admitted to killing her for this reason, and the two police officers, in which the two police officers can't help but admit that she has been purchasing the wrong type of peanut butter, and that is somehow a lacking quality or a deficient part of her doing her wifely duties, quote unquote. And just that kind of thing is exactly what I was reminded of with a lot of the absurd humor in these first two chapters, and kind of the overall tone of the book to this point as a whole, really. Very, very good stuff. Does anyone have anything that they wanted to add about chapter 1 before we get into the end of chapter 1, where he actually performs his stunt? Anything from the first couple pages?
I do think it's interesting that the dog is fed like chocolate cereal. I mean, it does, if you really analyze it way too much. I mean, dogs aren't supposed to eat chocolate. I don't know if everyone knows that. And it could be a commentary on how processed the food is, that it's chocolate, but it doesn't harm the dog because it's so processed or something.
It's a good point.
That's kind of how I took it. There's so there's so little chocolate in that chocolate that it's okay for the dog to eat. Yeah.
That's an interesting detail to me.
That's a really good call, Luke. Will, you were going to say something too?
I was just going to say that, again, talking about his other books, a lot of people point to Inherent Vice and say, it's like Pynchon wrote The Big Lebowski. No, Zoyd is Jeffrey Lebowski.
Yeah.
The little one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could even trace that back to knowing what we know to an extent of Pynchon's love of pulpy, I guess you could hard-boiled and noir, 30s and 40s era stuff. The Big Lebowski is The Big Sleep. No, Farewell, My Lovely, I think is what The Big Lebowski is, almost like note for note the same story. So you could even backtrack that, and like a lot of Zoyd, and a lot of Jesus, why am I blanking on
Doc?
Thank you, Doc Sportello. A lot of they share a lot of those similarities with those hard-boiled detectives from the Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Cain novels.
Yeah, and for anybody who hasn't read the rest of the book, they've just read these first 2 chapters. This is not to say that Zoyd becomes a PI. It's just that that's kind of the whole point with Jeffrey Lebowski, is he is not with the dude. He is not a PI. He's just a guy walking around. So until like the third act, he's not embraced that side of himself.
Mm-hmm.
And Doc Sportello is like a private investigator who takes his job seriously. Like there's a big difference there. I find those comparisons kind of lazy.
Yeah, that's a really good call. And speaking of just a guy walking around, after Zoid's first attempt to publicly declare himself insane by dressing in drag and menacing a bar full of loggers and sort of forest dwelling people, he then realizes he has to go jump through a plate glass window again. And as he arrives, he notices that there are federal agents there this time. In particular, a federal agent who has been trying to get him to turn to being a state's witness multiple times, or a confidential informant multiple times. And he throws himself through the plate glass window, and it is not real glass. So this whole scene that kind of ends the chapter, what did we think about that scene as a whole? The fact that it's not real glass, what that might be pointing to. What was our general thoughts on this portion of the first chapter?
So here's what I will have my wild ass theory that I want to try to continue to do as often as possible because I enjoy them.
We should come up with a drop to play before you do.
I know, right?
Your wild ass theories.
I'll have to develop a little soundbite I can pop in here. To me, and as with all of my wild ass theories, this could just be me really pulling something out of my ass here. But I immediately started thinking when the glass was revealed to be the sugar glass, as it's known, I think throughout the Hollywood industry. Mm-hmm. I read that as a sort of pointing out of the absurdity of how polished and sterilized a lot of pop culture in the 80s became, specifically music, where you had the I'll call it a generous use of gated reverb and overcompression in production and synthesizers, all these new technologies that come into recording that ended up becoming so dominant and just really making some of the blandest music possible.
How dare you make fun of the Human League like that?
I know, right? Well, here's the thing. Like, the thing is, not to defend Human League too much.
Okay.
Some of the 80s, like some of those really hyper polished acts, had some pretty good lyrics, but the music that they were put to was so just boring and bland. And when you hear covers of them, that's when the lyricality can really shine and you can really appreciate what they were trying to do. But they were just so obsessed with all that garbage, overproduction, to the point where you had artists that went in, like ZZ Top went in and absolutely redid all of their early recordings to have that gated snare sound on them. And it sucked. And you could not get any copy of that, not on vinyl, for decades. I think it was only in like the mid 2010s that they re-released them with the original recordings. So a lot of those analog recordings that had been done in the 70s and 80s, when they got quote unquote remastered in the 80s, had that polished veneer to them that the 80s were so notorious for. And so you took out a lot of that danger that jumping through a real plate glass window would have, and you effectively sterilize it. And it's this thing that it still can look like a spectacle, but when you examine it and when you participate in it, it doesn't have that same visceral kind of feeling, and so it lacks the same kind of punch that it could have. And you look at the punk movement and how quickly that spiraled out and flamed out and then became overly polished pop music and pop rock of the 80s. And the danger of rock and roll, your bands like, doing heroin and massive amounts of cocaine and whatnot, and writing these songs about this kind of dangerous lifestyle, quickly faded away into your Twisted Sisters and your Warrants and Poisons and all that. So that little thing made my brain go in all those different places.
So Cody's homework to everybody is to go listen to Soft Cell, and specifically to listen to the lyrics of
Tainted
Soft
Love?
Cell, non-tainted love Soft Cell.
Okay.
Which is, look, it's a synth pop band. I will defend. That is a darker band than a lot of people think
got
if you
some
listen
good
to their
songs.
lyrics.
Again, songs like Mad World and Everybody Wants to Rule the World, like
Tears for
genuinely the lyrics
Fears.
are pretty good, but the
Yeah.
music sucked.
Yeah, I disagree.
Yeah, that's a lot more contentious than I think you think.
I will
Yeah.
I will rephrase that as I have heard covers where the music is done better and really makes the vocal or the lyrics
I would assume
shine a lot
you're
more.
talking about Gary Jules's cover of
Gary Jules' cover is good. Ted Leo and the Pharmacists did a cover of Everybody Wants to Rule the World that was absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
It's harder to find on YouTube than it should be, but it's there.
Definitely. I think I don't think that's that crazy of a theory for a lot of the reasons that you already said. I think that there is certainly, again, talking about like how the 80s and 84 with the second, re-election of with not the second re-election, but the re-election of Ronald Reagan and all of the different cultural movements coming up, and mass marketing and mass production of things coming up in that time does have a thematic underpinning to the fact that now suddenly the glass is fake. Like the glass that he jumps through is fake. That is in of itself kind of a death of a prior era when he was actually sort of putting himself in danger. And as he talks about in I believe it's chapter 2, like he genuinely wonders to himself, like, have I been just centimeters away from impaling myself on a piece of glass this entire time? Like when he really starts thinking about the change from real glass to fake glass, a lot of those thoughts start to come up in his head. And I think that just feeds into the same ideas that like Zoyd is coming from an era that is gone. Like the hippies are gone. That whole thing is over. The whole sea changed everything. But also most things are becoming fake. Like hyper processed food is pretty fake. His daughter brings out a giant like bulk tub of guacamole that they must have bought at a store somewhere in chapter 2 that I don't think they're eating all at once, which means there's probably a lot of fake stuff in that as far as preservatives are concerned. And like also like a lot of people would call the 80s like a plastic decade where people started doing like cosmetic surgery and started having plastic like implants in various parts of their body and everything. Like that was when a lot of that started to come out. And then the same thing like with sterilization of music. So I think there is potentially like a thematic underpinning to that. My reaction reading it through is more that it is a kind of setup to have something to hold over Zoyd, in the sense of like, we know you didn't jump through a real glass window, which means that we could in theory take away your disability check. And we know that, and we have engineered a circumstance where you've had to come here and do this way, even though you wanted to do something differently. Like it's this concerted attempt by the government figures to get him to turn into a CI that now they finally have kind of a thing to hold over his head, is generally the thought process that I come away from this scene with. But I don't think your theory is that insane. I think that there's
I'll try harder next time then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say they are the same coin. Those are two sides of the same coin. What you've described, Katie, is the plot value.
Mm-hmm.
And Cody, you're talking about the more thematic thing.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, the thing that links those two ideas is the fact that that, like you said, Kate, the next chapter, Zoyd starts to realize, shit, I've been putting my life in danger this whole time. There's a lot there to be dug into about the way that exposing the potential of an artificial steak, STAKE, not lab meat, can really can really lead people to become someone who they don't want to be. That just by juxtaposing your own experience against something that is functionally identical but fundamentally entirely different, you can remove the entire purpose from your mind. And beyond that, I think that there's something here kind of similar to going back to Crying at Lot 49. We're talking about replacing one substance with another that looks identical in order to create a media sensation.
Mm.
Crack, 1980s. It was not declassified until much later that the CIA had its hand in the distribution of cocaine into the United States and into the formation of crack as a quote-unquote epidemic. But
And then specifically putting that into predominantly black neighborhoods.
Yep.
yeah. But Pynchon knew a lot of like old Black Panthers. Like he was hip in all the ways. He knew the rumors, and the rumors had been going around since the 70s, which was when it started that the CIA had started disseminating drugs. I think that all of those things are tied together in this scene. So I definitely don't think your theory is crazy at all, Cody.
Luke, did you have any thoughts on this scene?
No, I do really like this scene. It's entertaining. I'm kind of struggling how to formulate my thoughts on this. I mean, I myself have some pretty serious mental health struggles. I know Kate mentioned earlier in this episode that it does kind of seem like, at least here at the beginning, that Zoyd is faking everything in order to get the mental health disability check, mental disability check. There is some stuff in like chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and even I think later in the book that does point to the fact that Zoyd is not necessarily living in reality and stuff. I do think that his mental health struggles are perhaps deeper than this opening chapter would have you believe. I also kind of wanted to point out that, like not a lot of people, I mean, maybe not most people, in my opinion, would dress up in the opposite gender's clothing and jump through a plate glass window. And then I forget what the exact verbiage is, but he like menaces the cameras and menaces the cops.
Oh yeah, like bare
Oh
his teeth.
yeah.
Um,
Yep.
Not a lot of people are going to be doing that for poverty, a poverty level of money. Um, I do think there's also an aspect of, I think I already brought this up, but an aspect of the fact that mental health, mental illnesses, you don't just like, if somebody's walking around with a limp, and you see them walking around with a limp for a year or two or something, you can probably assume that they are at least able to get on disability and stuff. But, if you see somebody walking around screaming at the sky and stuff, you're not going to immediately assume that they have a disability. It's not something what you first think. You just first think of them as crazy. Um, so I do think it's interesting that Zoyd is forced to come up with a spectacle that seems to prove that he's crazy, if that makes sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's he can't, if he was going for a physical disability check, it'd be a completely different thing, where he'd have to like injure himself or something. Um, but I do think it is kind of a commentary on the government and how ridiculous it can be for somebody with mental health issues and somebody with like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, to prove the fact that they have that illness. Like I think I've shared a little bit at the end of Mason and Dixon about my own mental health struggles, but I've had some pretty serious mental health struggles. I'm bipolar, which I have shared with the co-hosts, and I have encountered people that thought I was doing it, that I was acting in a certain way or behaving strangely for attention, which is not the reason that Zoyd is doing this, obviously. But like people don't seem to really people seem to want some type of like actual like like physical telltale sign that you have the illness, if that makes sense. I'm kind
Right.
of
Yeah.
dancing around what I'm trying to get at. I don't feel like I'm articulating it well, but um I find all that interesting, like in um the fact that he has to do it yearly, the fact that one time is not enough, the fact that it's like an event is also very interesting to me. That it's like a local, like every year you would see it on the local news. Um,
And everyone
you know,
knows about it already too. Like
Yeah.
the way that the
yeah,
news crews talk about it.
Yeah.
the news crews are just sitting around talking about it, and then the owner of the log jam doesn't seem at all surprised to see Zoyd in that, arrayed in women's clothing and carrying a chainsaw. I think he says something like, "Oh, is it that time of year again?"
Yeah.
Um, it seems like Zoyd it's just kind of an accepted part of life in Vineland that Zoyd has to do this every year. And it seems to be kind of well understood by the others that this is something he has to do in order to make his living. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's
Mhm.
I think that's a telling or damnation of our society that not just in 1984 when the book takes place, but even up to 2023 now, where I think it comes down to a lot of people, and I say a lot and I mean a lot of people have a fundamental misunderstanding of mental health. And there's a number of factors that go into that we don't really necessarily need to get into. Suffice to say that, people generally don't understand how mental illness works. And, as someone who's suffered with depression for most of his life, like I've had to deal with people who think that just because someone's depressed that, they're always that way. And there's no, if I have shown any sort of happiness or been doing well, like it's proof that I don't really have anything wrong. And we see that a lot, I think specifically, I don't want to hamper on this too long, but specifically when you have comedians who have chosen to end their lives. Robin Williams is a prime example of that, where a lot of people couldn't wrap their heads around that because, oh, he's a comedian. How can someone who's funny all the time have depression? Like it doesn't, I think that highlights how fundamentally misunderstood mental illness is in this country. And that Thomas Pynchon was writing about this in 1990. And we haven't really come that far, in the almost 40 years since then now.
Yep.
Aside from having the ability to understand that it's not as generalized as we thought, that there's a lot of, I think the spectrum obviously has helped with getting an understanding of there, but that misunderstanding of how mental illness really works and how it exhibits itself is still a problem for us.
Yeah. I mean, it just within the past maybe 5 years became kind of normalized to have a therapist.
Yeah.
And like prior to that, if you heard that somebody had a therapist, your reaction was just like, oh, that person must be like severely disturbed.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the average person's reaction to that. And I think Luke, you were really getting to some pretty major stuff, not just with what this book talks about with a standpoint of mental illness and how that is sort of defined and looked at in this country's history, but like it is a commodification of mental. They're trying to take a person who may genuinely have, mental illness or some sort of warped view of the world. As you mentioned, he may not be reality, and are trying to make money off of it. Like certainly the news stations are, and are certainly trying to sort of recoup an investment, so to speak, of being willing to pay him these checks every single year by televising what he does, which is a very hyper-capitalist 1980s viewpoint, where it's just like, how can we make money out of this? Mm-hmm. But also the fact that, to your point, Will, like the fact that he's willing to, out of his own volition, like dress up as a woman and go menace people with a chainsaw initially, but then he's kind of forced into jumping out of the plate glass window, and everything that comes in the chapters after does point to the idea that there is probably something genuinely amiss there in his understanding of reality or the world around him, or his viewpoint on things. But it is impossible to see that. Like, you can see someone with a limp walking down the street and you know that something most likely happened to that person's leg, but you can't see someone who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression or anything. Like if there's nothing physically there. So it is almost as if Zoyd has to prove that there is something wrong with him by doing something physically in order to get any kind of recognition of that, which just once again feeds back into the feedback loop of your initial reaction to this is he's probably faking it for the money, which is exactly what a lot of people's reaction is to people who are on disability in general.
I'm going to say that none of what I'm about to say is to argue against any of the great valuable ideas y'all pulled out, because I think you're absolutely supposed to sit down and start reading the book with that frame of mind and start to think, oh, Zoyd, is he scamming the government? I guess that's kind of smart if you can. I don't know. He's eating year-old Fruit Loops. I don't know. But I find it really interesting, Luke, that you say what you said, because I came away with the exact opposite. If we were posing Kate's initial statement as like a center point and then yours as one side, I went way to the opposite side, and I'm not going to clarify that without saying that if you haven't read the book before, skip ahead like 5 seconds. I think he's entirely like capable and just doing this because he's in a trap. I think that nothing that Zoyd is doing is any of his own volition. And that's why he seems crazy, is that he is trying his best to look like he fits into this life that he has been forced into because he cares about his daughter so much.
Man, I wish we could talk more in depth about
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he does mention that song from the 60s that's about faking mental health issues to get a disability check. I do think it's really interesting that you can kind of go either way on it, to be honest.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think that you misread it or that I misread it. I think there's probably material in the book for both sides.
That's the fun of postmodernism, everybody.
Especially modernist concerns as to postmodern.
Yeah. So moving on to chapter 2, assuming that everyone had said everything they wanted to about the way that ends, we have...
I have one important thing to say.
Oh, please go ahead, Will.
It's haunting as hell to think about Pat Sajak giving genial vibes.
Oh my god.
That's fair. That's fair.
That is an alien concept. He has been a weird wax figure my entire life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now he's probably actually a wax figure.
Moving swiftly on.
So yeah, chapter 2, Zoyd goes home, and I really love the interaction between Zoyd and his daughter when he returns home before his daughter's boyfriend enters the picture. Just the dialogue between the two of them just rings so accurate to life of that kind of genial, slightly teasing father-daughter relationship that exists in a lot of people's households. And just, the way that they interact with one another and the way that they kind of joke with one another and play off of each other's sensibilities, I absolutely love about this early scene. And of course we get more fun, gross food. Just your lunch, maybe dinner is just a big old bag of Cheetos, which I love that it's rendered as Cheetos in the actual text of the book, because that is, I believe, how it was originally spelled.
I do think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And just watching like crap TV, and then eventually switching it over to Zoyd's daring feat of fenestration. You had a film concept idea, Cody, that you left in the show notes.
Yeah, so not so much I always love when he does these, and then he does these a lot in Vineland. These so-and-so starring in the so-and-so movie. And I before I say this, I do want to just point out how antique I feel now. Because when I was reading this chapter, the concept of having to wait for one show to finish before you can watch the thing you want to watch feels alien in 2023.
It's very real, though, or was, I should say.
Seriously, like that was how, and I know there's going to be plenty of people who are, as old as me or older, who remember that, and that was just the way it is. But I think we've become so used to the ubiquity of you just put on whatever you want to put on at whatever time you want to put it on now. The fact that it used to be that way, there was like 5 channels, and it was, you can't watch this until Pat Sajak is done with Wheel of Fortune. That's just how it was. That being said, the Paya Zadora and the Clara Bow story, anytime I see these, I have to dive into these names if I don't already know them. This was really interesting because this was a case of a sort of quote unquote bad actor playing a quote unquote good actor. Pia Zadora was in, most famously, this movie called Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, which if you have not seen it, please go watch it. It's probably one of the great, I hate Christmas movies with an undying passion. This is a good one. It's so bad, and it's universally considered like just one of the worst movies of all time. But she was also in Butterfly, which is an adaptation of James Cain's novel of the same name from 1982, which was also universally panned to the point where it was nominated for like 10 Golden Raspberry Awards. So she has this kind of distinction of being I hate to say bad because she's doing a job that I can't do. She just was universally considered not a great actor, playing Clara Bow, who was one of the more bankable silent film era actors. She is the reason for the term "the It Girl" is based on her performance in the 1927 movie It, which is about a horrendous clown that terrifies this group of children. It's a different movie. No, but she really was the term "the It Girl" came from Clara Bow, and she was literally like one of the most bankable star. Like her movies brought more people to the theater at the time than was known. But she's kind of been forgotten since then in the mainstream because of people like Greta Garbo and a lot of other actresses from just after her era who, because they were in talking pictures, Jesus, I sound old again, became more famous. But that was an interesting little tidbit that he tossed in there.
Yeah, that was a good cut. I was not familiar with that particular history, so I'm glad that you caught it. Before we get into the weirdness with Prairie's boyfriend, does anyone have anything to add to the first part of this chapter? I know it's a pretty short chapter, so I wouldn't be surprised much.
I do think it's really funny that Isaiah is just like apparently lurking in the background throughout this scene.
Yes, which gets
It's unclear how long they've been watching TV, you know? So like how long he's just kind of hanging out in the back.
It's like an hour or something, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like a while. I also really like that Prairie's like kind of buttering him up.
Clearly.
I don't have any and I don't have any kids of my own, but that's definitely something that middle school, high school age kids do is say nice things and do all this stuff and they kind of stab you in the back right after being nice. Or maybe not, they don't view it as stabbing you in the back, but that's basically what it is. Yeah, I mean I just love those two aspects of that scene.
Neither of my kids is that old yet. My son just started middle school, but so I don't know about the whole stabbing in the back thing. That was certainly me as a middle schooler, but damned if they don't hide and just show up at times. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was one of my favorite things to do as a kid.
Yeah, just lurk in the shadows and wait.
Lurk in the shadows and then make a business plan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. So getting to
wait.
Yeah, go ahead.
Magenta and acid green. That's all. Just needs to be said. I don't have anything to point to. Just saying it because it needs to be tokenized.
Totally fair. I agree.
I'm gonna put myself out there. I had a windbreaker that was those colors as a kid.
No, I mean that I think I did, honestly.
It's a good color scheme. I'm not gonna lie.
Like, bad.
Yeah,
it's
no,
a good
it's
color
not
scheme.
bad. It's not about that. It's that it's so ever present in his books that I haven't figured out what the hell it means. It has to mean something. It might just be his favorite colors. There's this whole thing where if you zoom in on a like an old school TV pixel at like really crap with a really crappy lens,
the CRT TVs,
green and magenta. No, actually, like early LCD TVs.
Oh,
yeah, and he would have been around LCD pixels. They existed in computers.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just my brain boggles every time I see those colors together in his books, and it's twice in this chapter. So please continue, Kate.
It's definitely there for a reason. whether Pynchon just likes that color, or just if there's something deeper. If the readers have any guesses, please feel free to email us what they think. Moving into the actual scene with Prairie's boyfriend, yes, the concept that he's just been standing there for God knows how long is hilarious, but it does get to a point that Will made a long time ago when we were talking about Vineland. And this might have just been in our last episode in Mason and Dixon. I can't remember exactly when you said it, Will, but that there is a repeated comedic motif in this book that Thomas Pynchon tries to backdoor character introduce a new person, like out of a sitcom, as many times as he possibly can in this book. And this is certainly one of the most like specific instances of it early on, where just that concept of Prairie being like, oh, he's right here, and then the door opens, and then either a laugh track or going like immediately is supposed to follow that, definitely. So I just wanted to harken back to your comment there, Will, because it is very accurate to how this book plays out, and is a huge part of the humor to it. And I'm also glad that the comment about rage rooms was left in the show notes for this episode, because I had the exact same thought when I was reading through this chapter, that his business pitch that he has for Zoyd, which is very strange that you would go to the father of your newly minted girlfriend who kind of hates you because you represent the death of his previous subculture and the arrival of something that he doesn't understand and kind of hates, to ask for a loan that for the building that this would happen in would have to be so large, but also more importantly for the insurance that this business would require, is truly wild that someone would think that this is a good idea to do.
Well, it's like a teenager's idea of what a business is. They think about like, I would go there, I would pay $20 to go do that. And
there's no thought about the logistics of how it works.
Yeah.
And this is very true. Like I was reminded of two things. I was reminded of rage rooms, which is this modern concept that's propped up in my personal experience, like within the last 2 years, that I feel like these have really become a thing.
It goes back a little further than that. I've seen some stuff that predates that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Where people can just go rent out a space for an indeterminate period of time, and they can just like break glass and smash things and just get like their aggression out, or their upset feelings about something out. That was the first thing that it reminded me of, definitely. So you were correct in that Isaiah's idea hits very differently in 2023 than it would have in 1990. But I also just, from the insurance aspect, thought about axe throwing bars, where every single time I walk past one of those, because they're everywhere now for some reason, like the concept of how much insurance you have to be paying as somebody who encourages people to drink alcohol, potentially to excess, and just have access to blades that they can throw in one particular direction. And
which is really a skill that you have to possess to do that right.
Yeah, absolutely.
People train to do that.
Yeah.
So, I can actually tell you how they do that. I know how they get the insurance for that.
Really?
They have you sign a form that says you have not had any alcohol in the past 24 hours.
Like an indemnification form, but you have to sign that before.
They don't let you. They quote unquote don't let you in if you've had anything to drink. I don't know if they actually police it. I swear to God, they have to. Jesus Christ, they better. But no, that's how they're getting around that. Is everything on paper says that you haven't had anything to drink.
It's the same with tattoo parlors that are open till like 2 a.m. in bar districts, where they have you sign something that you're sober, and like nobody ever is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do just want to say, rage rooms have existed since at least 2008.
Wow. Crazy.
I just looked it up. They started it most likely in Japan.
Interesting.
One thing that struck me about the Isaiah 2.4's business idea is that it did strike me as a very like pre-Columbine idea.
Yeah.
That was the other
That makes-
place my mind went. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like
Mhm.
immediately I was like, I try to kind of, I had to remind myself that Columbine took place after this book was released because I don't know if that would have made it through the editing process
I
7
don't
years
think it
later,
would've.
8 years later.
Yeah.
Even nowadays, I'm not sure if it would make it through the editing process.
But he
Good
could.
point.
There's
You don't
no
even put
way
it
he
on the
could have seen
page.
that.
No,
Yeah.
definitely not. It kind of date the story, and it's also, I mean, it's the mid '80s. That
Yeah.
it's also a time of action movies. That's when Jean-Claude Van Damme and a lot of those people were kind of getting a lot bigger and stuff. Rambo was
Yes.
around that time, I think.
Slasher movies too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
RoboCop. and all
violence
that
is
kind of
becoming
stuff.
commodified in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, the era of video violence.
That was around the same time the NRA switched from being an actual gun safety advocacy group to being
Yep.
what it is.
What they are now.
And I'm gonna point back to the hanging signifier I pointed to earlier. 1984. This is 2 minutes of hate, but personalized.
Yeah, that's fair. I also think it'd be interesting. I don't know the answer to this, but I also considered, like, if you go to a gun range now, which I've been to a few in my time alive on this planet, there are absolutely customized targets
Yep.
that look like Arabic people
Yep.
or that look
Mhm.
like particular, like, subsets of individuals. Like, that is absolutely a thing that you can
That's just the ones that are
purchase
probably
now.
out prominently displayed. I am
Yeah.
sure there are others that you can ask for.
I'm sure. Yeah, the ones that I'm describing are visible behind the counter.
Yeah.
It's one thing when it's literally a picture of Osama bin Laden,
Yeah, right.
but that's
right.
not what it is most of the time.
No.
Yeah. And so I don't know how you'd find an answer to this, but I would be very curious back to the 80s if that was even a thing yet, or even more importantly, like 1990 when it was published, or if that was him kind of once not predicting, but like kind of seeing the way that things were headed.
I grew up hunting a lot as a kid, and so I spent a lot of time as a kid. Like I'm talking like 5, 6, 7 at gun ranges in the early 90s. It wasn't that I knew of. It wasn't a thing at that time. Now, anyone older can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I don't think that kind of thing really started until post 9/11. But I could be wrong. There may have been like you could have maybe ordered personalized kind of thing, but most of those targets at that time were just the silhouette targets, where it's just the black form of a body, just shoulders in a circle for a head kind of thing. I don't recall there being an actual like visible person, short of like taping a picture on someone, because at the same time also dot matrix printers couldn't really pull off that kind of detail, so
It's
I
fair.
don't know how accurate they could have made anything like that.
Yeah. I think that over the course of these 2 chapters, what I've been struck by most is just how much of what he talks about just still has resonance in 2023. Like what Will said at the beginning of just how all of this stuff is just kind of still around, but isn't seen as crazy as it probably did in 1990 when it came out.
I do wonder if the phenomenon of individuals like printing out their own targets and then that turning into ranges having custom target prints comes from like the 80s and 90s military training montages. Like think of Men in Black,
yeah.
where it actually parodies those montages with that scene.
Yeah, and then there's the Men in Black where they're shooting at all these aliens and stuff, and then Will Smith is the only one that shoots at the human
kid.
target.
Yeah.
Yeah,
or whatever.
the kid with the atomic physics book. And another piece of more contemporary to us media that this reminded me of was the episode of Atlanta where Darius tries to take a custom target of a dog to a range, and so he sidles up next to all these big old redneck dudes wearing trucker caps and all, shooting at like cutouts of like I think there's one that's literally just like a child crying, and others that are, just racial stereotypes, and they all like threaten him to. They force him out at the threat of violence because they don't want to see him shooting at a dog's picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not one to one, but I do think that there's a lot of the same kind of vibe between these two scenes. I think there's a lot of the whole, okay, violence against people is fine as long as you pretend it's insincere.
Yeah, I was reminded of that scene as well, for sure. Getting to Isaiah as a character, and specifically Isaiah as a contrast to Zoyd, what are any thoughts you guys have on that? I feel like their interplay with one another and kind of the two different things they represent is very interesting, and is started to kind of get broken down in this scene. Did we have any thoughts or anything we wanted to talk about in that?
It is interesting, I think, because I think it's an interesting examination of the dynamic between someone like Zoyd, who would have been Isaiah's age in the 60s. And it's, the interesting thing is there's so much similarity between the hippies and the counterculture movement of the 60s and the punk movement of the 80s. When you really boil it down, they were trying to kind of get at the same thing, just in different ways. Where you had, in the 60s, it was a lot of, both. I should back up and look at the bigger picture. Both of them were, we need to dismantle the system because what is currently our ruling system is oppressive, and it's slowly, at the time, approaching a sort of fascism that we're going to get to a point of no return from. And capitalism in the 60s was kind of starting to head in the direction that it hit in the 80s when the punk movement came around. So they're both trying to essentially dismantle the same machine. I think the 60s just went about it and this is, I don't want to get too much into it because this is where the book goes from here. But in the 60s, it was a lot more carefree and maybe a little bit more, I hate to say fun. There was a lighter element to it. A lot of when you look at like groups like the Yippies with Abby Hoffman and those guys, what they were doing was a lot of social satire and pranking, and more geared towards let's bring down the man, but let's do it in a funny kind of way at the same time. Also a lot of drugs. Whereas in the 80s, you had a shift from that humor of it, because now what they failed to do in the 60s is impacting the kids in the 80s. So they're pissed off as hell, and rightfully so. And they're not being taken seriously by anyone, especially the people who really should be taking it seriously, like Zoyd, who was there when this whole thing started. So it's really, you're compounding this frustration on top of them. And for a lot of them to not be taken seriously really just adds to that frustration and that anger that is a lot more prevalent in the counterculture movement at that time. That's also where you had the straight edge movement with people like Ian MacKaye and Minor Threat and a lot of those bands, where completely eschewing any concept of using mind-altering substances, because I think they saw what it did to the people in the 60s and how it completely derailed anything they were trying to get at and left them with the wreck that now these kids are trying to clean up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think like I have a feeling that as this book goes on, Cody and I in particular, but maybe all four of us will end up talking about music a lot. I
was listening to Minutemen earlier today, so yeah, we'll talk about it a lot.
I was listening to Agent Orange on my walk back from work. But I think like it is such a perfect like encapsulation of that kind of evolution from the hippies to what came afterwards, and that like the hippies all thought that they could somehow break down this system through their own experiential behaviors, and then also just as like an example, like if people see that there's a different way to go about things, they'll just naturally join us. And then of course like that didn't work because there's no call to action. and if you're just on LSD all the time, like that's
Yeah.
that's unlikely to lead to anything profitable. Not that LSD can't be profitable, but like not the way the hippies were using it, especially in the late 70s. And so you have like the second generation that comes up after it that becomes very direct in its messaging, not just about anger, to your point, Cody, of like everything that the hippies failed to do, but also in the lyrics of the music that they were writing, like direct calls to action and direct like descriptions of the times that people were living in and the difficulties of that. And the way that I also like the fact that you brought up multiple genres of music and like multiple different movements in that, because there is no good boundaries between any of it. Like Iggy Pop is, I think, the best example of this that I can think of in a singular artist, and that like he was there for the proto-punk movement with the Stooges, and that was sort of at the death of the hippie period. And then the same year that all of the punk music started coming out in 1977, he released The Idiot, which is a post-punk album about the failures of punk music not working, is essentially what a lot of the like thematic content of that album was. So it was such a like weird period in that the predominant way of doing things for so long was gone, and it clearly failed. And now you just have all of these different artistic movements attempting to rebuild something out of it, and they're all criticizing each other, but also all kind of doing the same thing, but from a different lens. And it is just so like, it was particularly interesting to me that the depiction of Isaiah and his look is that, to me, it's like half metalhead, half punk, and that he is not squarely in either subgenre of music or like subculture in his presentation, and certainly not in the bands that he is playing with. Like he is orbiting between his own band, which seems to be of a punk thing, but is certainly more associated with like what sound like metal acts based upon their names. So it's just this sort of weird nebulous depiction of the anger and turbulation of that generation that is coming out through its music, and then subsequently his business idea, in very stark contrast to everything that Zoyd stands for. So I certainly came away with a very similar thought process to you on that. Did Luke or Will, did you guys have any additional thoughts with that?
Yeah, I do think it's telling that Isaiah is obsessed with the Uzi. I was just thinking, I mean, it does, like for punk rock and for metal music, there's going to be moshing. There's going to be a certain aspect of violence and danger to it that is just not present in the hippie movement, at least in terms of, like, you don't mosh at surf rock shows, like in, Zoyd was in a surf rock band, which does seem to kind of, Isaiah seems to be kind of making Zoyd obsolete, and Zoyd doesn't like it. Isaiah is, like y'all were saying, like people like Isaiah have kind of taken over the counterculture, and replaced, Zoyd's peace and love with, you don't necessarily associate the words peace and love with punk rock music or metal music. I'm struggling to kind of formulate my thoughts on that completely, but I think y'all kind of get what I'm getting at, where there's an inherent difference between the two movements and the two types of music, and just kind of the whole thing, where like the young gun is kind of moving in, and Zoyd feels threatened. Yeah.
Yeah, literally a young gun in the case of the Uzi. That was a recently made weapon.
Yeah. And I think, to go back on that, Zoid's fear, I think I think that's a good exemplification of the difference in these two generations, where you have Isaiah, who is, so full of this anger and this rage that's inside him, that, that's your punk movement there, which is a direct reaction to, as Kate and I kind of talked about earlier with the hippie movement. Really and truly, they had good ideas. They just got so bogged down in their own cloud of weed and LSD, and so you have in the 80s now, all these kids are like, they're starting these bands and they're playing this angry, fast music that these songs are 2 minutes, 3 minutes long, if that. And someone like Zoyd, who came from this era of let's take our time and we'll have these long, drawn out performances, and Isaiah's on the other side of that. Like, no one wants Dr. Fancy Feet's Feel Good Fun Time Factory anymore. We have to do something. We're trying to do something, and you guys are just holding back. And that I really and truly that kind of cycles again. I think, and we're getting the back end of that now in this time period where a lot of the that sentiment from the 80s is finally, it's taken a little bit longer, but I think the younger I hate to say kids, but the younger generation, the youth, sorry,
people like Will,
people like Will are as pissed off now as they were in the 80s at that time, and it's, Gen X was, as great as the music was for that time, like it was the same kind of thing with the 60s, like all these great, like we should do this and we should take down the man. We have zines and we're starting these underground movements and blah, blah, blah. But it just fizzled out again. And it's just, now we're back to where we need to do something. And the older generation, not my generation, the one before me, is still holding everyone back and not letting go. And that, I think that anger is relevant again, just as much as it was. I think Isaiah is a good representation at that time that a lot of people that age now would be.
Yes.
So I'm glad you brought up the cycling of it all, because I don't have a thesis to unite all of these things that are floating through my head that have come to a peak. But let's start with the fact that in A Crying of Lot 49, Metzger tells Oedipus the instant that she disagrees with him about anything, "Oh, you kids, you don't take yourselves seriously these days." And that is practically the tone that that Isaiah is using here.
Mm-hmm.
So sure, okay, that makes sense. Why it could completely make sense why the straight edge folks would say, okay, no drugs. We want to play music that's fast enough that you can't be on heroin, just to make sure that doesn't happen to us. And sure, whatever, that's fine. There's the fact that Isaiah 2:4 is named after the section of the Bible that talks about how after the Messiah comes, we will all be able to pound our swords into plowshares. Which indicates, obviously, I feel, that Isaiah's parents went from hippie freaks to just kind of Orange County Christians, right? And
which is what happened to a lot of them.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And furthermore, Isaiah gave him the 5-figure California orthodontia. So yeah, his parents aren't, they might have been peace-loving hippie freaks when they were young, but they certainly weren't when he was a teenager.
Yeah. Well, and just the fact that he himself, from a name perspective, represents the opposite of what him and his generation are, is just such amazing irony to the whole just cultural context of it. Yeah. Yeah,
and in particular, there is this thing in media targeted at Black Americans from around this time and in the 90s. There was and is to this day this kind of false dichotomy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And back in like the 80s and 90s, you would have these movies and TV shows where characters would literally say things like, "Come on, man, take yourself more seriously. More Martin, less Malcolm." And I find it very, very, very resonant. All of these things together in this one character of Isaiah 2:4. And I don't know what it is, but it's nauseating.
Yeah, and I think just to get back to the thing that Cody had mentioned about the the generation into faster, harder music and all of that, and kind of what we just mentioned as well with the we're gonna play music so fast you can't be on heroin, is that when you look at the origins of that, because punk is a British-born genre of music, there was certainly syncretism with some of the stuff going on in like New York and America, but what we define kind of as punk started in the UK. It was born out of the British counterpart to Ronald Reagan, basically saying that like none of the young men in particular in the country were kind of worthy of a job, and they all got home and didn't have money, didn't have much to do, so they just started playing instruments, and none of them were particularly like well trained or adept at learning how to play the instruments. It was just something they were learning to do because Margaret Thatcher sent them home from work and never gave them another chance.
Yeah.
And out of that was born this music genre that is very specifically a reaction to that, and has a lot of syncretism to the economic stuff going on in America with Ronald Reagan and everything that we've been talking about as it relates to the 80s as a decade and what that decade means from a cultural institution, from an economic institution, from everything. Like it was born directly out of the actions of what was a reaction to the hippies in the 60s and 70s in a governmental perspective. And so it's just it ties together, like Isaiah 2:4, the music he plays, what he represents, his name, all of that ties together so many different things that is going on from a standpoint of this set dressing of this book and of the issues politically and socially and psychologically in the 80s in America time, and how he is sort of the perfect end result of all of that. If you add all those things together, you end up with this kid.
And he's completely against it all. He's not controlled opposition.
No.
I'll say, just to end on my end at least, the whole crux of this discussion that we've been having, this whole thing is summed up in one sentence, and it's the biting insult that Prairie delivers to Zoyd when she says, "You've turned into exactly the same kind of father that used to hassle you back when you were a teen hippie freak."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which that's got to hit Zoyd so much harder than, a fuck you or anything like that. Like, she really got to the crux of everything that was going on right there.
Which is done in an economy of words, because the same insult is given to Doc Sportello by Bigfoot Bjornson when he talks about how Shasta left him and he's still there carrying the torch. And even in the case of Inherent Vice, that is taking place in a time period where the hippie movement was almost dead. Like, it is the last
on the dying breath,
the last days of that. And to have that delivered from your daughter to you when you still are under the impression that maybe like you're still holding things together, man. Like, that's gotta be just, like you said, devastating. So any funny parts that we haven't mentioned over the course of this discussion? The one that I will bring up that nobody has mentioned is the fact that Zoyd makes a joke about Isaiah's Halloween costume as being Jason, specifically from the Friday the 13th made in 1980, which, if you are not familiar with why that is funny, the default sort of idea of Jason in most people's heads is the giant guy with the hockey mask that eventually will be played by Kane Hodder in the later not Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th movies. Yeah. In the 1980 version,
very different.
Jason is I don't even really know how to describe what Jason is. He's an adult with the brain of a child, more or less, that has like an enlarged skull and like a misshapen eye and looks almost like an X-Files alien if it was trying to disguise itself as a human being.
It looks like they took the the human tumor growth thing for Total Recall and put it on a body.
Yeah, that's a better description than I was able to give. Yeah, so the fact that he specified in the text that it was Jason from the 1980 Friday the 13th made me howl with laughter, because you would have to be really dedicated to create either a mask or buy one or whatever he did to achieve that costume, but also just like, why are you dressing? Why is that your choice? It's so absurd. Yeah, it made me laugh really hard.
Mine is kind of slipped into a paragraph on page 11. It's the idea that Zoyd purchased a mantra from Van Meter, which I read that paragraph a couple times just to really enjoy the how that might be the most 80s thing I've ever heard in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the paragraph. Production staff murmured into walkie-talkies. Technicians could be seen through the fateful window, waving light meters and checking sounds outside as Zoyd, breathing steady, silently repeated a mantra that Van Meter, claiming it had cost him $100, had toward the end of his yoga phase last year hustled Zoyd into buying for a 20 that Zoyd hadn't really enjoyed discretionary use of. Just that idea, that whole concept just makes me laugh so hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think my most funny part is at the end of the mall scene, Prairie's friend, whose name I'm blanking on, tells Zoyd, "You'll see," and then we cut to Zoyd, walking into this very nice upscale bar in drag with a chainsaw.
Mm-hmm.
Just Zoid's confusion about the changes in the bar and how he's like, I would never cut this place up. You've done so much work on it. Is pretty funny to me. It's super absurd, and it does kind of show how human Zoyd is and how nice he is, and how he's not looking to hurt anyone, basically ever. But I just love that mental image of this guy talking to this teenage girl, like he's like buying a dress, and she knows what he's up to.
Yeah.
And then he shows up, and she's already warned him, and it's just completely different from what he's expecting. And he still tries to go through with it anyway, and then kind of realizes that it's pointless.
Well, and I love the way that I read that sort of as like a joke about her trying to warn him about all the gay people.
Yeah,
Oh,
that is
interesting.
true. And I mean, Zoyd, this obviously isn't funny at all, but Zoyd is sexually assaulted in the bar by his fellow
the way
bar
it's
patron.
phrased is kind of funny. But yeah, the
Yeah.
actual scene is pretty unpleasant.
But is any other funny parts that anyone wants to bring up?
Yeah, I'll point to the fact that Pynchon has clearly decided to make fun of the fact that everyone's like, why does he put all these unnecessary details in his books? By putting the years of every movie after every title.
The years, but also the sheer number of brands and famous people mentioned in 19 pages.
It's a lot.
Yeah. And
we're just starting.
Along those lines, the actual scene that I thought was pretty hilarious. What's this Mr. Wheeler? What happened to you lunch meat sucker? This line having climaxed at a last get-together when, from a temperate discussion of musical differences, feelings had swiftly escalated into the rejection on quite a broad scale of most of one another's values. Well then, sir, replied the NBA-sized violence enthusiast who might or might not be fucking his daughter, I must have meant lunch meat only in terms of our joint strange fate as mortal sandwich, equally exposed to the jaws of destiny, and from that perspective, what's it matter really that you don't care for the musical statements of Septic Tank or Fascist Toe Jam, jive-assing so obvious that Zoyd had no choice but to thaw. That's some masterclass bullshit.
Yeah.
By which I mean, it's completely nonsensical, but I'm for it.
I special shout out to the description of the cucumber neon sign.
Yeah.
Where it's a pretty quick quote, so I'll just read it. Where it says, "News crew stragglers were picking up a few last location shots of the cuke and its famous rotating sign, which Ralph Jr. was happy to light up early. A huge green neon cucumber with blinking warts, cocked at an angle that approached, within a degree or two, a certain vulgarity."
That was going to be my most Pynchon part of the chapter, is that last phrase, the cucumber looking vulgar.
That's such a good line.
It's so good, yeah. Are we ready to move into quotes?
Sure.
My quote actually comes from like this same paragraph, which ends chapter 1, where starting just after that it says, "Did Zoyd have to show up next day at the bowling alley? Technically, no. But in the Federale's eyes, there'd been a glint that Zoyd could still see behind the one-way auto glass, even as the nightly fog rolled up over the great burn on toward 101, and Hector was driven away into it. Zoyd could feel another hustle on the way. Hector had been trying over and over for years to develop him as a resource, and so far, technically, Zoyd had hung on to his virginity. But the little fucker would not quit. He kept coming back, each time with a new and more demented plan. And Zoyd knew that one day, just to have some peace, he'd say forget it and go over. Question was, would it be this time or one of the next few times? Should he wait for another spin? It was like being on Wheel of Fortune. Only here there were no genial vibes from any Pat Sajak to find comfort in. No tanned and beautiful Vanna White at the vision to cheer on the wheel, to wish him well, to flip over one by one letters of a message he knew he didn't want to read anyway. I just, everything about that quote, I think, symbolizes why I love this book. Like it simultaneously makes reference to, again, like pop culture of the period and how so much of it has just become referential to different commodities, but also just the description of how, as we kind of talked about, countercultural movements and figures just slowly getting broken up by the FBI and other government, bureaus. We have the same thing, and that this person has been trying to get Zoyd, who's been a hippie for the longest time, to flip over and work for him, and that finally, we also have the Thomas Pynchon, capital T they idea of those outer forces that are going to control things, whether you want to or not, and how he doesn't want to go to the bowling alley, but he knows he's going to, and how this might be the final sort of straw before he, as the book puts it, loses his virginity. I just think it's an amazing way to end it in the chapter. It's an amazing piece of writing from its description and its comparison to Wheel of Fortune, and just, I love it. And also, like Will said, like the whole genial Pat Sajak thing, that underscores the fact that there is something nightmarish in what he is. I love that quote.
That's a good one.
Yeah, you stole it. Thanks.
I was gonna ask.
Congratulations.
It's been so long.
It has been a while. Well done. Mine is on page 15. So I do want to point out, I checked on. So I have 2 copies of Vineland. I have the UK paperback, which took some doing to find a good copy of for a reasonable price, but I found it, and I'm happy I have it because that's my favorite cover of this book. It's, for anyone curious, it's the one with everything on the cover. I'll use it for the YouTube videos that we put up for these episodes, but it's the Minerva print. Sorry?
The décolletage one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the paginations seem to be the same, at least on the Penguin and the Minerva copy that I have. So
my pagination is off with the first edition little brown hardcover. Yeah.
Okay. Mine's on page 15, is right after the introduction to chapter 2. And it starts, "Looking good, Dad." On the tube, Zoyd came blasting out the window, along with the dubbed-in sounds now of real glass breaking. Police cruisers and fire equipment contributed cheery chrome elements. Zoyd watched himself hit the hardpan, roll, come up, and charge the camera, screaming and baring his teeth. Footage of the pro forma booking and release weren't included, but in tubal form, he was pleased to see that the dress, day-glow orange, near ultraviolet purple, some acid green, and a little magenta in a retro Hawaiian parrots and hula girls print, came across as a real attention-getter. Over on one of the San Francisco channels, the videotape was being repeated in slow motion. The million crystal trajectories, smooth as fountain drops. Zoyd in midair with time to rotate into a number of positions he didn't remember being in, many of which, freeze-framed, could have won photo awards someplace. Next came highlights of his previous attempts. At each step into the past, the color and other production values getting worse. And after that, a panel including a physics professor, a psychiatrist, and a track and field coach, live and remote from the Olympics down in LA, discussing the evolution over the years of Zoyd's technique, pointing out the useful distinction between the defenestrative personality which prefers jumping out of windows, and the transfenestrative, which tends to jump through, each reflecting an entirely different psychic subtext, at about which point Zoyd and Prairie began to drift away. I chose that because I think for anyone who feels like the writing dipped in quality in this book, I think that's a prime example of how he has not lost his. The imagery is amazing. It's funny as hell, like the fact they're pulling in people from across the world to analyze this man in a dress with a chainsaw jumping through a window, like on an almost molecular level that we're really looking into this. Like there is so much going on in this paragraph that it's just I can't understand how people can the fact like Harold Bloom saying it. There's not a redemptive sentence. This is a great book. I love it.
Harold Bloom is the reason why Suttree is overlooked in favor of Blood Meridian. So I'll sign a petition if you want.
Harold Bloom. Bad takes. That guy had a lot of bad takes.
I know people hold him on a pedestal, but I don't know.
I never have.
My friend Tom. That's how he addresses Pynchon, by the way.
Yeah. Gross. I guarantee you Thomas Pynchon does not like Harold Bloom.
But that's what he said in classes. It's not a joke.
Go on about
no,
Bloom,
I believe that. Ugh. Luke?
So my favorite quote is the opening paragraph. I'll just read the end of it because that's kind of my favorite. Is he groaned out of bed. Somewhere down the hill, hammers and saws were busy and country music was playing out of somebody's truck radio. Zoyd was out of smokes. The Zoyd is out of smokes part hit me pretty hard. I mean, I used to be a cigarette smoker until the past week, and then I switched to vaping. But just I love how kind of natural all of that feels, and how he's waking up in the afternoon. There's all these birds chirping. He's been dreaming. There's is kind of a feeling of like golden sunlight draping the entire landscape. It's kind of pastoral in some ways. I just really love the opening paragraph.
It's a great one.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a backup quote, Will?
I'm reading off of an ebook, so I can't point to any page here. The Cucumber Lounge property extended back from the disreputable Neon Roadhouse itself into a few acres of virgin redwood grove. Dwarfed and overshadowed by the towering dim red trees were 24 motel cabins, with wood stoves, porches, barbecues, waterbeds, and cable TV. During the brief North Coast summers, they were for tourists and travelers, but through the rainy remainder of the year, occupants tended to be local and paid by the week. The wood stoves were good for boiling, frying, even some baking, and some of the cabins had butane burners as well, so that along with wood smoke and the austere fragrance of the trees, there was an all-day neighborhood smell of cooking in the air. Not only is that just a very, very pleasant sonically to me, but also it's a beautiful scene that is still troubling with all of these very dark themes that the rest of these first two chapters tackle. I think it's a really nice little encapsulation.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to most Pynchon part of the chapter. I will go last just so that I potentially don't steal Will's 2 segments in a row.
That's ridiculous.
Mine that I've already mentioned is the cucumber looking like a penis, basically.
Yeah,
it's a very Pynchon-esque detail, something that I don't think a lot of writers would necessarily include or think of. It's in that kind of nether region between absurd and funny. I really like that detail.
Yeah,
I would say also if they included it, they wouldn't write it as well.
No,
they would make it would be way too blunt and ham-fisted. So yeah.
Be like they looked at the sign, and from a certain angle, they almost thought that it looked like a penis.
Yeah, exactly.
It reminded him for some reason of something phallic.
And he had to use the bathroom. Yeah.
Mine is just the general concept of what Zoyd does for quote unquote employment. I just think that's it's a lot of different things at the same time, and I think that exemplifies a lot of what Pynchon does.
Yeah. Also, shout out to the note you left in there. The general concept of Zoyd's means of employment. When I first read that in the show notes, I had a hard time stifling my laughter. Just the way you phrased that was funny.
Thank you.
Will?
Well, if you're gonna force me to go,
I am.
I will choose the choice for the choice for Hector to immediately go que rico, que sabroso. That shit's fucking hilarious.
Yeah.
I agree.
Because
That's really good.
it's just sugar, man. What are you talking about? I get it is. That's one of the more human things that Hector does in this book is make that joke.
Yeah,
pretty
that's
great.
true.
Yeah, true. My most Pynchon part of the chapter would be specifically the description of the level of production going on around the actual process of Zoyd jumping like us. Like the fact that they have like lighting.
Yeah, it's a real backlot.
Like it basically turns into a film set. Which just the absurdity and just the detail there just stood out as being particularly Pynchonian to me. Like it isn't enough that the general concept of Zoyd's means of employment is, but also the fact that when he goes down there is a backlot set up around what he's about to do without him calling anybody, without him like organizing anything. Yeah, they're just there.
You know, I'm thinking about it now, and maybe that's his kind of acknowledgement of people's assessment of his work is, you know, all that production to just have this moment, this one brief thing. You know, I think that was a criticism that was probably leveled against Gravity's Rainbow, that it was to say what it was saying. So maybe that's you know, a little aside at that.
You might be onto something there, Cody.
Maybe that's my wild ass theory for the episode.
You're gonna steal one of my wild ass theories.
I need to get my red string and my bulletin board cleared off.
There you go. Pepe Sylvia. So before anyone steals anything else, given Will's threat, let's move on to listener comments and questions. Cody, do you want to read the email that we got since your episode?
Yeah. So for anyone who cares, we recorded our bonus episodes in one go and chopped them up and released them piecemeal when we did. So this comment from one of our listeners actually came after the first of those bonus episodes in which I talked about Nier Automata, a game that I hold near and dear to my heart. And it says, "Hi, I've been subscribed to your podcast for a long time, but haven't actually listened to anything beyond the introduction as I'm waiting for the right time. Big Mason and Dixon reread. Just wanted to say kudos on the Nier Automata episode. I always thought there was a strong Pynchonian feel to that game, to the point that I found it a shame that no one else was making the comparison. Can't wait to dive into the rest of your podcast next time I delve into the work of my favorite writer. Kind regards, James." James, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that there's other Pynchon and Nier Automata fans out there, and I hope that when you get started on the Mason and Dixon reread, or if you're joining us for the Vineland read, I hope that we can add something to your experience there.
Yeah, I agree completely. And also, to all of the people who requested Vineland, and it was more than one person.
It was, yeah.
It was a good chunk of the communication we had on this podcast, like when we first started. I would like you all to email us.
Please, yes.
Yes. So many of you requested this book specifically. I'm not saying that we chose the book because you guys were requesting it. We were kind of already going to do it when those requests started to come in.
No one tells us what to do.
Like, please, everyone, write in. Let's talk about the book. Like, as we talked about at the top of the show, this is such an under-discussed, underappreciated, strangely kind of maligned book by Thomas Pynchon. If this can become a discussion between more than just the four of us on the merits of this work and how it is underappreciated. I think that's really what we would all like to see out of it. Certainly on a surface level, outside of the bigger discussions themselves as we get into them. But that would be my ask. That would be my homework.
Yeah.
Cody's homework is to listen to Soft Cell. And my homework.
I would also like to put out there, if you genuinely do not like this book, write us an email and we'll tell you why you're wrong.
Oh yeah, we'll have a bad take corner.
Yeah, absolutely. Genuinely, I would like to hear if anybody does not like the book and has read it and wants to engage in discussion. We will respectfully engage in that. I would genuinely like to have a dissenting voice that provides that kind of contrasting opinion. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to be like reductive and an asshole about it, so that we could make fun of you, that would be appreciated too.
We'll welcome that as well. Yeah.
All right, so I think that just about does it for the first 2 chapters of Vineland. I hope everyone who's listening to this, whether they've read the book or not, whether they like the book or not, has enjoyed the discussion. I think that the depth to which we were able to go into out of only pages of material here does a lot of work to illustrate why this is a book that we wanted to do early on, and why it is that we've been excited to talk about it. So next week we'll be back with a discussion on chapters 3 and 4 of Vineland, and until then, we will keep on keeping on, gathering sources and resources for our discussions as we move through the 3rd book in our wonderful Thomas Pynchon discussion podcast. I am your co-host, Kate.
And I'm Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
We'll see you in the next episode.